Every night in Seoul, someone disappears. But on the worst night of Lyra Vale's life, the night she discovered the man she loved had sold her to a criminal empire, she didn't disappear. She ran. Through the rain, through the blood, through streets that swallowed screams like they were nothing. And when she finally collapsed in a freezing alley with hunters closing in from every direction, the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave was the most dangerous man in the city. A man she should have run from even harder. This is a story about survival, betrayal, and the terrible price of falling for someone who lives in the dark. If you're watching this right now, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The heel snapped at the worst possible moment. Lyra felt it go, a small, stupid crack beneath her right foot, and she pitched sideways into a wall slick with rain, her shoulder hitting brick hard enough to send white sparks across her vision. She caught herself with both palms against the wall and stood there for 2 full seconds just breathing, just forcing air down a throat that had forgotten how to work properly. The alley smelled like garbage water and motor oil and the particular kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there for days. Behind her, maybe a block back, she could hear them. Not voices, not footsteps, just the low idle of a black SUV moving at walking pace through the narrow street, the headlights sweeping the alley entrance with patient, methodical confidence. The kind of confidence that came from knowing the prey had nowhere left to go. Lyra pressed herself flat against the wall and looked down at her right foot. The heel had sheared off completely at the base. She was wearing a silk blouse that cost $400 and now had a sleeve torn open at the seam from when she'd thrown herself over a chain-link fence 3 blocks back. Her hair was plastered to her face. She could feel a cut above her left eyebrow. She'd caught the corner of a dumpster lid during the fence climb, and when she pressed her fingers against it, the blood came back warm, even in the November cold. She pulled off both shoes, held them for half a second, then set them down in a puddle and kept moving in her bare feet on wet pavement. The flash drive was inside her coat, tucked flat against her sternum inside her bra. She could feel the sharp plastic edge of it every time she breathed. 4 centimeters of molded plastic containing enough documentation to put 40 people in prison and burn down half of Korea's financial sector. 3 hours ago, she had been sitting at a restaurant table in Cheongdam-dong, watching Ethan Reeve pour wine with his easy smile and his careful hands, and she had still believed that, despite every instinct screaming otherwise, that she had simply made a mistake, that the discrepancies she'd found in the departmental accounts were clerical errors, that the shell company transfer routes she'd traced over 3 weeks of stolen nights in the office had some innocent explanation she was too tired to see. Then she'd placed the folder on the table between them and watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. Nothing. Not surprise. Not guilt. Not even the performance of offense a normal person would reach for automatically. Just a kind of settling, like a mask adjusting itself to account for new information. His eyes had moved to the folder, then back to her face, and in that fraction of a second she had seen the calculation happening behind them. She'd watched him decide something, the way you'd watch someone decide whether to step over a crack in the sidewalk. "Lyra," he'd said, with the same voice he used to tell her she was overthinking things. "You need to listen to me very carefully." She'd listened for about 90 seconds. That was how long it took him to explain in quiet and reasonable tones that she had spent the last 3 years unknowingly serving as the clean face for a financial laundering operation that moved $60 million annually through the investment firm's Seoul division. That her name was on documents she had never personally signed or thought she had signed for purposes she had been told were routine compliance filings. That the men who owned that operation were not the kind of men who tolerated loose ends. That she had 2 options: disappear quietly on terms they controlled, or be disappeared on terms she wouldn't survive. He'd reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I tried to protect you from this," he said, "for as long as I could." The worst part wasn't the betrayal. The worst part was that she had almost believed him anyway. There was something in the way he said it, that particular register of exhausted regret, that her nervous system had been conditioned over 3 years to read as honesty. Her hands had gone cold and her brain had started negotiating with itself, looking for the version of events where this was survivable, where there was still a table to bargain at, and a version of her life that didn't end in a ditch. Then she'd look down at his hand covering hers and notice the faint ring of pressure against her wrist where his thumb had settled. Not a reassuring touch, a grip. She'd stood up from the table faster than she knew she was going to and walked directly toward the restaurant entrance. She heard him say her name once, sharp, stripped of the warmth, and then she was through the door and into the rain on Apgujeong-ro and running before she'd made a conscious decision to run. That had been 3 hours ago. Now she was barefoot in an alley in Junggu with the SUV sweeping closer behind her and the flash drive pressing its plastic edge into her chest with every ragged breath. She turned left at the end of the alley, then right, then left again, threading through passages between buildings that were barely wider than her shoulders, stepping over things she couldn't see clearly in the dark. Rain hammered the tops of the buildings above her and came down between them in a curtain. She could hear the river somewhere behind her, the Han, wide and black and churning in the November storm. And she was using it as a reference point, trying to keep it behind her and move toward the lights of a main road where cameras and people and visibility might at least complicate things. Her feet were numb. That was a problem she filed away for later. She came out of the alley passage onto a service road and stopped. A second SUV sat idling at the far end of the block, parked across the road at an angle. The headlights were off. She could see the dim shapes of at least 2 men in the front seats. Behind her, the first SUV had found the alley entrance. Lyra put her back against the nearest wall and stood absolutely still for 10 seconds, just thinking, or trying to think. Her mind kept skittering sideways to things that weren't helpful. Ethan's voice saying, "I tried to protect you," the particular way he smelled on winter mornings, the argument they'd had last month about the Christmas trip she'd wanted to take and he'd canceled without explanation, and she had to physically bite the inside of her cheek to drag herself back. One problem. One choice. Right now. She looked across the service road. There was a 24-hour convenience store on the opposite corner, its sign throwing out yellowish light through the rain. The store meant a phone, or at least witnesses, or at minimum a locked bathroom where she could sit on the floor and figure out what came next. She took 2 steps away from the wall. That was when she saw the man standing beneath the convenience store sign. He wasn't moving, wasn't sheltering from the rain. Just standing on the wet pavement in a black overcoat as if the storm were happening in a different dimension that hadn't reached him yet. He was tall enough that his stillness had a quality that most men's movement didn't. His face was angled slightly down, but she could make out the line of his jaw and the absolute blankness of his expression in the store's yellow light. He didn't look like a customer. He didn't look like anything she had a clean category for. Then the first SUV turned onto the service road behind her. Its headlights swept across the wet pavement and caught her for half a second in full light, barefoot, bloodied at the hairline. Her silk blouse soaked through and transparent, her face wild with the particular expression of a person who has been running long enough that fear has burned through to something colder underneath it. The SUV stopped. Lyra looked at the store entrance, then at the men getting out of the parked SUV on the far end of the road, then back at the man in the black overcoat who still had not moved. She crossed the road. She was not proud of her reasoning. It was not strategic or calculated. It was the kind of thinking that happens in the oldest parts of the brain, below language and below logic. A raw directional pull toward the one thing in her field of vision that looked more dangerous than what was already behind her. She crossed the road in 10 running steps and stopped 3 feet from the man under the convenience store sign, breathing hard through her nose, and looked directly at his face. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected. 30, maybe 32. His features were sharp in a way that looked less like good bone structure and more like something that had been refined by years of deliberate stillness. The tattoos she'd half-registered from across the road disappeared under his collar and up the side of his neck, dense black line work that she couldn't read in the poor light. His eyes, when they finally moved to her face, were absolutely steady. He looked at her the way you'd look at something unexpected on a road you'd driven 1,000 times. Not alarmed, just noting it. Behind her, Lyra heard the SUV door open. She heard boots on wet pavement, more than 2 sets. The man in the black overcoat looked past her shoulder toward the sound. His expression didn't change. But something shifted. The quality of his stillness altered, The way the air over concrete changes just before a storm actually arrives, a half second before the first drop. He said something low in Korean that Lyra didn't catch. The men who materialized from the doorways and parked cars around him didn't respond with words. What happened in the next 45 seconds was not something Lyra could fully reconstruct afterward, and she would spend a long time trying. She remembered a sequence of sounds rather than images, suppressed gunshots that landed more like fist impacts than the crack she'd expected, the screech of a tire, two thuds of impact that carried weight behind them, the splintering sound of a windshield taking sudden stress. She remembered spinning toward the alley entrance and seeing a man down in a puddle, face toward the rain, arms wrong. She remembered the second SUV reversing hard and fast and disappearing around a corner with a sound like the city deciding it was done with that particular decision. She remembered taking 3 steps toward the alley at the far end of the service road, and then the ground came up. Not violently, not all at once, more like something being lowered, a slow tipping of her horizon as her legs stopped communicating with the rest of her, and the cold that had been working on her feet for the last hour finally reached something essential and switched it off. The wet pavement pressed against her cheek. She was surprised by how warm it felt against her face compared to the air. She thought very clearly, the flash drive. She thought, I have to get up. She did not get up. Somewhere above her she heard footsteps, and then the sound of the rain changed quality, blocked suddenly by something overhead. And she felt a hand against her face. Large. Warm with the specific warmth of a person who runs hotter than the world around them. The palm pressed against her cheek, and 2 fingers found the pulse point just below her jaw and stayed there for a moment. She tried to say something. What came out was not words. The man in the black overcoat said something in Korean again, this time to someone else nearby. His voice was completely level, not urgent, the voice of someone who had dealt with worse and considered this manageable. Lyra's vision had narrowed to a gray ring around a bright center that kept shrinking. Through it, she could see his face angled down toward hers, expressionless still, but present, the way walls are present. Solid. Immovable. Something you could press against. She pressed against it, or tried to, and the gray ring closed all the way. The last sensation she registered before the dark took her completely was warmth. His hand, still against her face, warm and steady in the freezing rain, while Seoul churned on around them, indifferent and beautiful and merciless, the way cities always are when someone is dying in one of their alleys. She thought, I don't know who you are. She thought, I don't know if that matters. Then she thought nothing at all. The warmth remained for another moment after she lost consciousness. Long enough to be deliberate, long enough to be something more than efficiency. Then it withdrew, and the city kept raining. She woke to firelight, not the urgent snap of something burning out of control. The slow, contained crackle of a fireplace set into a wall of pale stone, the kind of fireplace that costs more than most people's monthly rent and knew it. The sound of it was almost offensively comfortable against the memory of wet pavement and screaming tires. And for 3 full seconds, Lyra lay completely still, with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling above her and doing the basic accounting of the situation. She was alive. She was horizontal. She was warm, and the ceiling above her was coffered white plaster with recessed lighting that was currently dialed low enough to be kind to opened eyes. Then she tried to sit up, and the cut above her eyebrow introduced itself with significant force, and she made a sound that was not graceful and pressed her palm against her forehead. Don't. The voice came from the far end of the room, male, low, accented in a way that was hard to place. Korean cadence with something else underneath it, something that had spent time in English long enough to make the Korean feel deliberate rather than default. Not a suggestion, not quite an order either. Something in the middle, the kind of word that expected to be listened to without needing to raise itself. Lyra sat up anyway. The room resolved itself around her in stages. It was large, the kind of large that stopped being a room and started being a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides showed Seoul below, and below was the only accurate word for it. The city was down there in the November dark, like a circuit board viewed from altitude. All those neon threads and arterial roads, the Han a black seam dividing it, the bridges slung across it like sutures. Snow had started. She could see it moving against the glass, horizontal and fine, lit from below by the city's ambient glow. The furniture was spare and dark, expensive in the way that didn't announce itself. A whiskey glass sat on a low table near the windows, mostly empty, and beside it a phone face down on the stone surface, and beside that, a man. Kang Min-jae stood with his back to the window and his hands in the pockets of his trousers. He'd removed the overcoat. The shirt he wore underneath was dark, collar open at the throat, and she could see the upper edge of the tattoo work that covered most of what was underneath it. Dense geometric line work running up from his sternum and fanning out across his collarbones and up his neck with the kind of commitment that wasn't decorative, that was declarative. His face in the low light of the room was exactly what it had been in the service road, calibrated, contained, giving away nothing it hadn't decided to give. He watched her sit up, watched her press her hand to her forehead, watched her take the room in with the systematic scan of someone assessing threat vectors, which made something shift briefly behind his eyes, almost approval, before it settled back into neutral. "The cut is closed," he said. You don't need to hold it. Where's my coat?" "Chair by the door." She could see it from here. The flash drive was inside the lining pocket. She calculated the distance. "Don't," he said again, with the same flat patience. She looked at him. "I already have it," he said. The air went out of the room. Lyra set both feet on the floor. Her feet were wrapped, she noticed, in what appeared to be expensive medical gauze over a layer of something warm, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the man across the room and tried to remember everything she knew about staying alive in situations where the immediate threat had changed shape. The men in the SUVs she'd understood. She'd understood their logic, their instructions, their purpose. She'd had a framework for that. This room, this man, this city laid out below them like a problem he owned the solution to. She didn't have a framework for this. "You went through my coat," she said. "I found a flash drive. That's mine." "Everything in my building is mine," he said. "Not as a threat. More the way you'd state the altitude of a mountain. You don't know what's on it." "I do, actually." He picked up the whiskey glass and looked at it for a moment before setting it back down without drinking. "I've known about the Beck operation for 14 months. Your documentation adds approximately 80 pages to a file that's already significant." Lyra stared at him. "Who are you?" she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more the implication of one, the ghost of an expression that had decided not to fully arrive. "The man who pulled you off the pavement," he said. "The man whose penthouse you're sitting in. The man who, at present, is the only reason the people who want that drive don't already have it." He looked at her directly. "Does a name feel necessary right now?" "Yes." A pause. Brief. The kind of pause that meant the person was used to not being asked directly. "Kang Min-jae," he said. She knew the name, not from anything official. Nothing official would carry it. She knew it the way people who worked in Seoul's financial sector for 3 years came to know certain names, sideways, through absences and euphemisms, and the particular way certain topics exited conversations when they were raised. The name that appeared in the margins of other conversations. The name that made compliance officers carefully not write anything down. She looked at him and understood, with the particular clarity that came from having nothing left to lose, exactly what kind of dangerous she had moved toward on that service road. "You're going to want something," she said, "for keeping it." "I want several things," he said. "The drive isn't leverage. The people who want it will burn the city down before they let it reach a prosecutor." "I know." "Then what?" "I need to know," he said, quiet and precise, cutting the question off at the knees. "Every name on that drive that you discovered personally, as opposed to every name on it that Ethan Reeve pointed you toward." Lyra was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled behind her. Outside, Seoul kept burning with cold light. The snow moved sideways against the glass in long, fine sheets. "Why does that distinction matter?" she said. Min-jae looked at her with the calm of someone who only said things he'd already decided were necessary. "Because Ethan Reeve," he said, "did not send you to that restaurant tonight to have a conversation. He sent you there to be collected. The documentation you found on your own is real. The documentation he led you to, a pause, brief, surgical, is designed to implicate a specific set of people who are not, in fact, involved with the Beck operation. The room seemed to contract slightly. Lyra said, he was going to use me to take out his own father's competition. While making you the source, Min-jae said, which means the moment that drive went anywhere official, you'd be the one sitting in front of a prosecutor explaining why you assembled a document that destroyed 4 unrelated businesses and protected the actual criminal network. She thought about the restaurant table, his hand over hers. I tried to protect you. She thought, he had always been 3 steps ahead. She thought, and I handed him everything. The men in the SUVs, she said. Were they Ethan's? Some. The rest work for Beck. He paused. There's a distinction, but it's currently academic. He sold me to his own father's organization? He sold you to a logistics problem, Min-jae said. You were a variable he needed removed cleanly. His father's organization was the most efficient available option. She heard herself say distantly, we were engaged. Min-jae said nothing. He didn't offer her the performance of sympathy, and she found, unexpectedly, that this was the right choice. That sympathy right now would have been an unbearable condescension, a way of making her smaller inside the fact of it. His silence left the fact its actual size, which was enormous and ugly and real, and treated her as someone capable of standing next to a thing that large without needing it managed for her. After a moment she said, why did you take me in? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Because, he said finally, I have a file on Beck that I've been building for 14 months and couldn't use, and you walked into my street carrying a piece of it I didn't have. A beat. And because, he stopped. Something moved across his face briefly. Some private reckoning, arrived at, and then immediately contained. You can sleep. You're safe until morning. That's not an answer to what I asked. No, he said. He picked up his phone from the table and moved toward a doorway at the far end of the room, unhurried, as if the conversation had reached a natural end by his determination alone. Lyra said, Min-jae. He stopped. Didn't turn around immediately. A half-second delay, the kind that told you the use of his name had landed somewhere it wasn't entirely accustomed to landing. Then he turned. Why did you really bring me up here? In the low light of the room, with Seoul burning cold behind the glass and the fireplace turning everything amber and the snow pressing against the windows with its patient, indifferent weight, Kang Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Because when you cross that road, he said, you look directly at me. A pause. Most people look away. He left the room. Lyra sat on the edge of the bed in the enormous penthouse and listened to the fire and looked at the city below and turned that sentence over in her mind like a stone with something written underneath it. She reached inside the neck of her blouse and pressed 2 fingers against her sternum where the flash drive had been. The space was empty now. She thought about everything that was on it, every transaction record she'd traced herself, every offshore account she'd mapped across 3 weeks of stolen hours, every document that bore her name and the name of a shell company she'd never heard of until 6 days ago. She thought about Ethan's face at the restaurant table, that settling, that adjustment, that moment of deciding. She thought about his hand on her wrist and how long it had taken her to read it correctly. She thought, I am in the penthouse of Seoul's most dangerous man with no shoes and no documentation and no phone and no plan. She thought, he has everything that can save me or destroy me. She thought, and I told him my name. Somewhere in the building below, a door opened and closed. Faint voices in Korean. The sound of the city 30 floors down, sirens, the river, the low thrum of a metropolis that never actually slept, just shifted its violence to different registers. She lay back against the silk pillowcase and stared at the ceiling. The fire kept crackling. Sleep came faster than it had any right to, which meant her body had decided, below the level of her conscious control, that it trusted something about this room. She wasn't sure if that was survival instinct or the worst decision she'd made in a night, already full of terrible ones. She wasn't sure there was a difference. In the hallway outside the room, Min-jae stood with his back against the wall and the flash drive held between two fingers, looking at nothing in particular. From this angle, through the partially open door, he could see the edge of the bed where she was already going still with exhaustion. He turned the drive over once, put it in his pocket, walked to the window at the end of the hallway, and stood in front of Seoul in the dark, the way he did most nights, the way that had become something between habit and vigil over the past several years. The city below was a system, and systems had pressure points, and pressure points meant leverage, and leverage was the only currency he had truly understood since the age of 19. He understood the flash drive. He understood the back organization and how to dismantle it and what it would cost. What he did not understand, what sat in his chest with the blunt insistence of something that had no business being there, was why, on a service road in Yeonggu, in the middle of a November storm, one woman crossing toward him through the rain with blood on her face and terror stripped down to something harder had felt like a door opening in a room he'd thought was permanently sealed. He watched the snow move against the glass. Downstairs somewhere, his phone began to ring. He looked at the screen. Ethan Reeve. Min-jae stared at the name for 3 full rings. Then he pressed the side button, silenced it, and put the phone back in his pocket. Walked back down the hallway. Stood for a moment in front of the door to the room where Lyra Vale was sleeping in his silk sheets and her torn silk blouse, one hand pressed flat against the mattress beside her face, her breathing finally slow. He pulled the door almost closed, but not all the way, and went back to his vigil at the window and the city below, and the problem that had just gotten significantly more complicated in ways he had not anticipated and would not admit, yet had anything to do with her. In the morning, he would need answers. In the morning, the drive would need to be verified. In the morning, Ethan Reeve would stop calling and start sending people. But in the hallway of a penthouse 30 floors above a city that had never once asked his permission before trying to kill him, Kang Min-jae stood at his window and felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, something that was not the cold mathematics of power and threat and countermeasure. He felt the specific gravity of someone else's presence in a space that had only ever held his own. He didn't name it. He was not ready to name it. But he didn't walk away from it either. The snow kept falling on Seoul. And somewhere in the city below, Ethan Reeve's phone went to voicemail, and a different call was made to a different man, and decisions were set in motion that by morning would make the previous night look like a rehearsal for something much, much worse. The morning came in gray and cold through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The kind of light that didn't so much illuminate Seoul as expose it. Every rooftop, every bridge cable, every arterial road laid out in flat November clarity with nowhere to hide. The snow from the night before had settled in thin patches on the window ledges and then stopped, as if the city had considered committing to winter and decided against it. Lyra woke up the way she'd been waking up since she was 22 and working 90-hour weeks in her first analyst position. All at once, fully, with her brain already running a list before her eyes had finished opening. She lay on her back in the silk sheets and looked at the coffered ceiling and let the list run its course. 1. She was in the penthouse of a man who ran organized crime in Seoul the way a CEO ran a Fortune 500 company. 2. The flash drive was no longer in her possession. 3. The man she had spent 3 years planning a life with had tried to have her killed. 4. Her name was on documents she hadn't signed, attached to transactions she hadn't authorized, which meant somewhere in Seoul's financial enforcement apparatus, there was now a file building itself around her. 5. She had no phone, no shoes, no money, and no passport because her passport was in the apartment she shared with Ethan Reeve, which was currently the last place on earth she could go. She sat up. The cut above her eyebrow had been properly closed. She could feel the pull of medical tape, and someone had left a glass of water and 2 white tablets on the nightstand that were either painkillers or something else. And she stared at them for a moment before taking the water and leaving the tablets where they were. Clothing had been left on the chair by the door. A dark gray cashmere sweater, folded, still tagged, women's sizing that was approximately right. Dark trousers. No shoes, but thick wool socks. She stared at the pile for a moment with a feeling she couldn't cleanly name. Something between the practical gratitude of a person who needed clothing and the sharp discomfort of being the kind of situation where someone else had anticipated her needs, which implied a degree of control over her circumstances that she hadn't consented to. She put the clothes on. She found him in the main room off the kitchen, which was not the room she'd woken up in. It was a space that looked like it had been designed to hold meetings. A long table, clean surfaces, 2 laptops open, a printer running something through its feed tray. Min-jae was standing over one of the laptops with a man she hadn't seen before, both of them looking at a screen and speaking low-register Korean that stopped the moment she appeared in the doorway. The second man looked at her once, then at Min-jae, and moved to the far end of the room with the kind of trained discretion that told you he'd been performing discretion professionally for a long time. Min-jae straightened up. He'd changed from the night before. Black trousers, a dark charcoal dress shirt with the sleeves pushed back. The tattoo work covered both forearms to the wrists, she could see now. The same dense line work, interconnected in ways she couldn't trace in a single look. His face looked like he hadn't slept, or had slept the way certain people slept, briefly and without anything you could call rest. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He looked at her for a moment, then moved to the table and sat down himself, which was not the power move she'd expected, and therefore briefly disoriented her before she caught it. "There's coffee," he said. "The kitchen is through there. If you're going to be functional, you should drink some." "I'm functional." "You've been running on adrenaline for approximately 12 hours. You're not functional. You're performing functional." He turned back to the laptop. "There's a difference." She went to the kitchen. She poured coffee because her hands were shaking slightly and she didn't want them to. When she came back to the doorway, she held the cup in both hands and looked at Min-jae from across the room and said, "Tell me what's on the drive that you didn't already know." 16 names in the financial sector I had partial documentation on. 3 politicians I had circumstantial connections to, but no direct evidence. And a set of transaction ledgers going back 8 years that tie the Beck family's hospitality businesses directly to narcotics revenue from 4 countries. He didn't look up. That last piece is what makes it worth killing for. Ethan told me those ledgers were company compliance records. Ethan told you what you needed to believe to keep going to work every day. The coffee was very hot and very good, and she hated that she noticed the second thing. "Where is he now?" she said. "His apartment, under observation." A pause. "He's been on the phone since 6 a.m. "With who?" "His father. 3 members of a private security firm his father retains, and twice with the director of financial crimes enforcement at the Seoul Metropolitan Police, which tells you how deep the institutional capture goes." Lyra processed this in silence for a moment. "He's building a case against me," she said. It wasn't a question. "He filed a preliminary report at 7:42 this morning. You're described as a former employee who accessed restricted company systems without authorization, removed proprietary documentation, and is suspected of involvement in the deaths of 2 company executives." She put the coffee cup down on the counter behind her, carefully, because if she held it while he finished that sentence, she was going to crush it. "What 2 executives?" "Hwang Jun-sik and a man named Park Dae-won. Both found dead last night in separate incidents the police are currently treating as unrelated." His tone remained absolutely level. "Neither of which you had anything to do with. Both of which Ethan arranged to create a credible narrative." The room was very quiet for a moment. "He killed 2 people," she said. "He had them killed. To frame me. To give the police a reason to look for you that had nothing to do with the actual financial crimes. Which means the moment you surface through any official channel, you're a murder suspect, not a whistleblower." He finally looked up at her. "Which is why you're here." "I'm here because you decided I should be." "You're here because the alternative was being collected off a service road in Jeonggu by men who would have taken the drive and disposed of you." He held her gaze. Steady, flat. "I made a calculation." What was the calculation? Something passed across his face, brief, contained, gone before she could fully read it. "That you were more useful alive," he said. She picked up the coffee again, took a sip, set it back down. "Useful," she said. "Yes. And when I'm no longer useful, Min-jae looked at her for a long, calibrated moment. That's not a variable in the current model, he said. That's not an answer. No, he said. It isn't. The other man at the far end of the room cleared his throat, not rudely, just marking presence. And Min-jae looked at him, and something passed between them that ended with Min-jae turning back to the laptop and the conversation closing with the particular finality of a door you hadn't seen swing shut. Lyra took her coffee to the window. Below, Seoul moved through its morning with complete indifference to the fact that her life had been taken apart and reassembled into something unrecognizable overnight. Traffic crawled across the bridges. A delivery truck doubled parked on a narrow street, and another driver laid on his horn for exactly 2 seconds before giving up. Steam rose from a street food cart on the corner far below. She watched it for a while because it was the most ordinary thing visible, and she needed ordinary things, even at altitude, even through glass, even the tiny version. The man at the far end of the room left through a side door. She and Min-jae were alone. "Tell me about Ethan's father," she said to the window. She heard Min-jae push the laptop back slightly. Baek Sung-il, 63, built his first legitimate business, construction, in the early 90s, used it to launder money for a mid-tier criminal network that was subsequently absorbed or destroyed by his own organization over 15 years. Technically, retired. Actually, the operating mind behind everything the Baek Syndicate does at the executive level. A pause. His son has been his primary instrument in financial operations for the past 7 years. Ethan told me his father was a real estate developer in Busan. Ethan's father is the reason 3 sitting members of the National Assembly vote the way they do. He's the reason 2 port inspection directors have been looking the other way for 6 years. He has enough institutional leverage in this city that a direct legal approach against him has failed. A slight pause. Failed to produce results every time it has been attempted. She turned from the window. Someone tried to prosecute him. Someone tried. He met her eyes. Once. The prosecutor in question is currently serving a 12-year sentence on charges that were assembled with a speed and specificity that told everyone watching exactly where they had originated. "And what are you doing with your 14 months of files?" she said, "if not building a prosecution?" Min-jae was quiet for a moment. "I'm building something else." That's a non-answer. It's the answer I'm prepared to give. She walked back from the window and sat down at the table across from him. Not because he'd invited her to, just because standing at the window felt like choosing a position, and she wanted to choose a different one. "You want to dismantle him," she said. "Not through courts. Personally." Min-jae looked at her the way you looked at someone who had said something accurate at a time you hadn't expected accuracy. "I want to remove him," he said carefully, "from a position he has held for 30 years through methods that are not available to prosecutors or police forces operating within institutional constraints." That's a very careful way to say you want to destroy him. "I want to make certain," Min-jae said, "that by the time the legal machinery catches up to Baek Sung-il, there is nothing left of his operational infrastructure to protect him. No leverage. No blackmail. No favors owed. No men willing to take instructions." He paused. "Courts work better with corpses than with kings." "He's going to know I'm here," Lyra said. "Ethan will figure it out." "Ethan already suspects. He's not certain. He'll be certain by tomorrow morning." "And then what?" "And then we have approximately 48 hours before he moves to force the issue." Lyra sat with this for a moment. "You keep saying we," she said. Min-jae seemed to register this with a fraction more attention than he'd been giving the laptop screen. "The drive is mine," he said. "The documentation you personally developed is significant. You're the only person who can distinguish the legitimate evidence from the fabricated evidence Ethan planted in your research path. And you have 3 years of institutional knowledge about the firm's internal structures that my organization has spent considerable time trying to develop from the outside." He paused. "Those things together constitute a working relationship." "Those things together," she said, "constitute you needing me." A silence. Not uncomfortable. Not comfortable either. The kind of silence that acknowledged something had been said that didn't require immediate response. "Yes," he said finally. Outside, the November sky deepened from gray to the pale pewter that meant more snow was coming. Lyra looked at the man across the table from her. The the contained stillness of him, the tattoos disappearing under his cuffs, the slight tension in the line of his jaw that was the only physical tell she'd cataloged so far that indicated anything was less than perfectly managed, and made a decision that she knew, even as she made it, was partly strategic and partly something else she wasn't ready to name yet. "Then let's start," she said. "Show me what you have on Bayek, and I'll tell you which pieces of what I found are real." The next 3 days inside the penthouse had the quality of a siege conducted in extremely expensive surroundings. Min-jae's people moved through the space with efficiency and very little conversation. A rotating set of men who arrived, delivered information or materials, received instructions and departed, none of whom looked at Lyra directly except to track her position in the room. She was not a threat to them in any physical sense, and she understood that. She was something else, an irregular variable in a system that had been running on clean, known quantities, and they managed her the way they managed anything they hadn't been fully briefed on, with a neutrality that was politely hostile at its edges. She worked at the long table in the main room. Min-jae had given her the flash drive back. Or rather, he'd placed it on the table in front of her without ceremony the morning of the second day and said, "Walk me through it, everything you found yourself. Start at the beginning." She'd looked at the drive, then at him. "You made a copy," she said. "Several." "Then why?" "Because I want to understand how you found it," he said. "The pathway matters as much as the destination." She walked him through it. All of it. The 7 weeks before Ethan's revelation, the discrepancies that had first surfaced in a routine quarterly audit she'd been assigned in late September. The offshore account trail she'd followed through 4 jurisdictions across 3 weeks of late nights. The moment she'd realized the shell company she was looking at was not an anomaly, but an architecture, something built and maintained with the kind of care that implied institutional protection. Min-jae listened without interrupting. Not passive listening, active, the kind that moved forward to meet the information, that occasionally stopped her with a precise question and then stepped back to let her continue. He had a particular quality of attention she hadn't encountered before, total, unperformed, without any of the performance of attentiveness that most people substituted for the actual thing. It was, she realized on the second afternoon, the most unsettling thing about him. More unsettling than the men with guns at the door. More unsettling than the city laid out 30 floors below them, like a territory he owned. More unsettling than the flash drive and the dead executives and the murder charges assembling themselves around her name in some police database downtown. The fact that when Kang Min-jae listened to her, she felt heard. On the third evening, they ate dinner at the long table because neither of them had stopped working at a point that would have made a separate meal sensible. One of his people had brought food, proper food, not the kind of thing that got ordered out of convenience, which meant someone in the building's lower infrastructure was cooking, and Min-jae had either requested this or it happened automatically, and either option told her something about the structure of his life that she stored carefully away. They ate in relative quiet for a while. Then Lyra said, "Tell me how you got into this." Min-jae looked at her across the table. "Into what?" "What you are. What you do." She held his gaze. "I've been in this apartment for 3 days. I know your file structure better than I know most things about my own life right now. I've seen enough to know you're not what most people would call a criminal." "Most people would absolutely call me a criminal." "Most people would be right," she said. "I'm asking you what happened." A pause. He set his chopsticks down, a deliberate motion, the kind that meant something was being decided. "I grew up in Incheon," he said. "Specifically in a part of Incheon that Baek Sung-il's organization had controlled for 20 years. He said it flat and even, the way you gave information when you had decided to give it, and were not interested in dressing it for consumption. My father ran a small shipping logistics business. Legitimate. Completely. He refused protection arrangements for 12 years because he was the kind of man who thought principle was a sufficient defense against the world." Lyra was quiet. "He was wrong," Min-jae said. "What happened?" "When I was 19, he was given a final offer. He refused it." A pause, barely perceptible. "I found him at the business 3 days later. The business no longer existed in any recoverable sense. Neither did he." The fireplace crackled. Outside, snow had started again, moving sideways across the windows in that fine, relentless way. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her for a moment, checking the register of it, she thought, checking whether it was the performed sympathy she'd been afraid of getting herself, and seemed to find it clean. "I spent 2 years learning everything the organization that destroyed him had ever done," he said. "Then I spent 8 years building something capable of being taken seriously by men who operated on that level." He paused. Baek Sung-il's organization is the last architecture standing from that period. Everything else I've already removed. "You've been doing this for 10 years, she said. "For your father." "I've been doing this for 10 years, he said, "because someone has to and because I turned out to be built for it. My father is the beginning of the reason. He's not all of it." Lyra looked at him across the dinner table in the penthouse 30 floors above a city that had been trying to kill her for 72 hours, and felt something shift in the geometry of the space between them. Not yet, but differently. A reconfiguration, the way you recalculated a distance after new information. "When I saw you collapsing in that alley," she said, and stopped. Min-jae looked at her steadily. "Last night you said," she started again. "You said I looked like you felt 10 years ago." A long pause. "Yes," he said. "What did you feel 10 years ago?" Something in his face moved, not much, but visibly, a controlled fissure in the controlled surface, and he looked down at the table for the first time since she'd known him, which felt significant in a way she couldn't immediately measure. "Like everything I'd believed was built on something that could be removed in 3 days," he said. "Like the ground had specific plans to keep going down." He paused. "Like I was completely alone in the middle of something too large to survive alone." She said nothing. He looked back up. "You crossed that road," he said. "You were terrified. Your feet were bleeding. You had no weapon and no plan, and every rational calculation available to you argued against approaching a stranger in that situation." A pause. "But you crossed anyway. I didn't know who you were." "No," he said, "but you made a decision anyway, under maximum duress, without complete information." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. That ghost expression, the one that was almost but not quite a smile. "That's not nothing." Lyra looked at him. He looked back. The fire crackled. She thought, this is the part where something changes, and the thought arrived with perfect clarity and a particular kind of dread that was not entirely dread. And she did not move toward it or away from it, just let it sit there in the room with them both, and took another bite of food and said, "Show me the financial structure on the hospitality side of his operation again. I think I found something this afternoon that connects to a set of accounts I traced in September that I dismissed as noise." Min-jae looked at her for one more moment, then he pulled the laptop toward him. "Here," he said, and they went back to work. It was the following morning, the 4th morning, a Tuesday, cold and clear, with yesterday's snow hard on the ledges and the Han River visible from the windows as a flat silver line between the city's halves, that the penthouse received news that collapsed the careful structure they'd been building. Min-jae's phone was on the table between them. The message came from a contact Lyra had come to understand was embedded somewhere inside Seoul's financial enforcement division. She read it the same time he did because the phone was between them, and neither of them moved to prevent it. The message contained 2 sentences. The first, "Warrant issued this morning, KSIC and Financial Crimes Joint, Lyra Vale." The second, "They're calling it premeditated. Ethan Reeve is listed as a cooperating witness." The room was very still for a moment. Then Min-jae said, "He moved faster than I anticipated." "He was always faster than you anticipated," Lyra said. Her voice came out even, which surprised her. "That's his entire methodology. He stays ahead of what people think he's capable of. The warrant changes the timeline. The warrant changes everything." She looked at him. "Every official channel is closed now. The police are looking for me. KSEC is looking for me. Any prosecutor I try to contact is going to receive a call from Bake's people before I finish introducing myself." "Yes." "So the only way this ends," she said, "is your way." Min-jae held her gaze. Yes, he said again. She thought about this, thought about what his way meant, concretely, for the specific people involved. For Ethan, for Baek Sung-il, for the men who had followed her through the rain 4 nights ago on instructions from someone who had shared her bed for 3 years and apparently found this entirely compatible with arranging her disposal. She thought about the prosecutor who was now serving 12 years in a cell. She thought about her father, who was alive and in Busan and had no idea any of this was happening, and who would turn on his television in some number of days and see his daughter's name attached to a story about financial crimes and murder, and she needed to not think about that right now. All right, she said. Min-jae looked at her. Tell me what the next step is, she said, and I'll tell you if I can do it. Something passed across his face. Not the ghost expression, not the almost smile, something less controlled than either of those, something that arrived without his permission and was gone in half a second. And then he said, "There's a gala, 3 days from now, Imperial Aurora Hotel. Annually, it brings together the top tier of Korea's financial and political establishment under a charitable umbrella. Baek Sung-il will attend. His son will attend. 16 of the people on your flash drive will be in that room simultaneously for the first time in the 14 months I've been building this case." And I attend every year, Min-jae said. But this year, I need someone beside me who can identify in real time, by sight, which of those 16 people were on your independent discovery path versus Ethan's planted path. Lyra looked at him. "You want me to walk into a ballroom full of people who want me arrested," she said. "I want you to walk into a ballroom full of people who want you arrested," he confirmed, "beside a man none of them will approach directly, which makes you, for the duration of the evening, effectively untouchable." A silence. "That's insane," she said. "It's the fastest route to a position where the evidence can be used," he said. The warrant is a piece of paper generated by a system Baek owns," Min-jae said. "It has the power of the institution behind it. I have the power of every threat this city has ever found expedient to ignore." He held her eyes. "In that room, on that night, the warrant means nothing." Lyra sat back, looked at the silver line of the Han River through the windows, thought about Ethan's voice on the phone she no longer had, 3 days ago, saying, "I tried to protect you." Thought about the feel of his thumb against her wrist and how long she'd taken to read it. Thought about the prosecutor in his cell. Thought about what his way meant. She thought, "There is no version of this where I come out clean." She thought there never was. 3 days, she said. 3 days, Min-jae confirmed. "I need a phone," she said. "A clean one. And I need to contact my father." "Done. And I need—" She stopped. He waited. "I need to know," she said quietly, "that when this is over, when Baek is gone, and the evidence is released and whatever you're planning is finished, I need to know you're not going to make me disappear because I know too much about how you operate." The room was very still. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment, the longest he'd held her gaze since the night in the alley, longer than dinner, longer than the flash drive conversations, long enough that the silence had texture. "I need you to say it," she said, "not imply it. Say it." "You're not a loose end," he said. "You're not in a category I apply that logic to." A pause. "I don't—" He stopped. A brief, internal adjustment, something being managed. "I don't operate that way with people who—" He stopped again. The silence stretched. Then his phone lit up on the table between them, and the name on the screen was not Ethan this time. It was a Korean name she didn't recognize, but Min-jae's expression shifted the moment he saw it, and he said, "I need to take this." He took it into the hallway. His voice, through the partially closed door, was low and quick, and had lost the measured pace it carried when he was in the room with her. Whatever was coming through the phone was stripping that away. She watched his silhouette through the frosted glass panel beside the door, the rigid line of his shoulders, the hand that pressed flat against the wall as he listened. He came back 2 minutes later. She read his face before he spoke. "What happened?" she said. "The 2 men I had monitoring Ethan's building," he said. "They stopped checking in 40 minutes ago." She waited. "We found them," he said. A pause that weighed something. "They're dead," he said. "Both of them. In a car 2 blocks from Ethan's building." He looked at her. Something in his face had gone to a place beneath the controlled surface. Not fear, not anger exactly. Something more elemental than either. Something that lived at the foundation level and had been disturbed. "Ethan didn't wait 3 days." Lyra stood up. "He's coming here," she said. "Not here. He doesn't know specifically." Min-jae stopped, looked at his phone again. "He knows the building." "How?" "Because he's Baek Sung-il's son," Min-jae said, "and Baek Sung-il has owned 2 members of my building's security staff for He was already moving toward the hallway when the elevator at the far end of the penthouse corridor produced a sound that was wrong. Not the normal arrival tone, something lower, mechanical, like the system being overridden manually from below. And every light in the penthouse dropped simultaneously to emergency backup red. And from somewhere in the building's lower infrastructure came a sound like... The sound was a concussion, not an explosion in the cinematic sense, not fire and shockwave and debris raining from a shattered ceiling. Just a single, dense, mechanical thud from somewhere below the 48th floor that moved through the building's bones like a fist through drywall, and then settled into a vibration that Lyra felt in the soles of her feet on the hardwood floor. Then the emergency lights came on. Red amber, low, casting everything in the particular color of bad decisions. Min-jae was already moving before the vibration finished. Not running, but with the compressed urgency of a man whose body had already calculated the geometry of the situation while his conscious mind was still receiving the information. He pulled the door to the main corridor and said something sharp into the phone in Korean, and then said to Lyra, without turning, "Hallway. Now. Stay behind me." She was already moving. The corridor outside the main suite was a long, straight run to the elevator bank, flanked by pale stone walls and the kind of recessed lighting that was currently dead, the emergency backups throwing everything into that red-amber cast that made distances unreliable. 2 of Min-jae's men materialized from doorways at the corridor's far end. She'd seen them before, the quiet ones, the ones who tracked her position without looking directly at her. They were not quiet now. One had a phone pressed to his ear and was speaking fast and low. The other had produced a weapon from somewhere beneath his jacket and was watching the elevator indicator panel with an attention that had gone very still and very specific. The panel read 43, then 44, then 45. "Stairwell," Min-jae said. "Min-jae." The man with the phone said something back. 3 syllables, clipped. And Min-jae's jaw tightened, a small thing, the only visible response to whatever the 3 syllables had communicated. "What?" Lyra said. "Stairwell below 45 is compromised," he said. "Someone came up." "How many someones?" "Unknown." He looked at the elevator panel. 46 now. "Enough to put 2 of my people in a car 2 blocks away." He turned to the man without the phone. "The roof." A brief exchange, 2 sentences. The man without the phone nodded once and moved. Min-jae took Lyra's arm, not roughly, but with the specific firm intention of a person who was done with the preliminary conversation, and moved her toward a door at the corridor's end that she hadn't registered before. A service door flush with the wall, painted the same pale stone color, invisible unless you knew exactly where to put your hand. He knew exactly where to put his hand. The door opened onto a concrete utility stairwell, unpainted, lit by a single cage-covered fluorescent that flickered once and held. The air in it was different from the penthouse, colder, with a metallic edge, the smell of a space that existed for function rather than habitation. Lyra went through the door. Min-jae came through behind her and pulled it shut. In the sudden concrete quiet of the stairwell, she could hear her own breathing and his, and the distant mechanical complaint of the elevator somewhere in the building's infrastructure, and below that, faint but present, footsteps ascending. Min-jae held up one hand. She stopped breathing. The footsteps below resolved into a count, at least 3 sets, moving with the particular cadence of people who were not trying to be silent, who were, in fact, making enough noise to be heard, which meant they either didn't care or were trying to push movement, which was worse. Min-jae's eyes went to the ceiling of the stairwell, then to the door above. Then he said very quietly, "Change of plan." He turned and went back through the service door into the red-amber corridor. Lyra followed because the alternative was the stairwell with the ascending footsteps, and she had made peace, over the past 4 days, with the operational logic of following a man who had been navigating exactly this category of situation for a decade without dying from it. The corridor was empty. The elevator panel read 47. Min-jae moved to the door of a room she hadn't been in. The second room on the left, locked, which he opened with a code he entered by touch without looking at the keypad. Inside was not a bedroom or a meeting room. It was something else. A narrow space with a single desk and 3 monitors and more cables than she could track in the low light, and a wall of what appeared to be building schematic displays. Floor plans overlaid with colored indicators, some green, some red, at least 4 currently red on floors below them. He moved to the desk and hit 3 keys, and one of the monitors lit up with camera feeds. She saw the lobby first. 4 men in the lobby, not the building's security. The building's security were on the floor in 2 separate corners, both moving, but neither moving quickly. The specific slow movement of people trying to recover from being put down hard. The 4 men in the lobby were in black, tactical without being uniformed, the kind of dress that said private and said professional and said somebody had paid for quality tonight. She saw the elevator interior, 2 more men, armed, looking at the floor indicator with calm patience. She saw the stairwell below 45, 2 men ascending at a measured pace, which meant they already knew no one could come down and they had time. She saw a camera feed from outside the building, street level, November dark, the cold, clear sky with the Han visible a few blocks south. And on the street she saw 3 more vehicles, black, idling, spread across the building's approaches with the geometric precision of a cordoning operation. Min-jae stood in front of the monitors for approximately 4 seconds. She watched him absorb the situation with the same quality of attention he'd given the flash drive documentation. Total, organized, moving forward to meet the information without flinching from what it contained. Then he picked up a radio on the desk and said 2 words in Korean. The response came back immediately. She couldn't parse the Korean fast enough, but she read his face reading it, and his face said the response was not good news. "The roof is blocked," she said. He set the radio down. "The roof access is controlled from the security desk in the lobby," he said, "which is currently occupied by people who did not come here to negotiate." The elevator panel on the wall monitor ticked to 48. Min-jae looked at it. Something happened in his face then that she had not seen in 4 days of close proximity. Not fear. He was constitutionally not built for the version of fear that showed on surfaces. But something adjacent to it. The recognition of a configuration that even his decade of navigation had not previously produced. An arrangement of pieces on a board that his particular method of playing did not have a clean answer for. He looked at that for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at Lyra. "I need you to stay in this room," he said. "Lock the door from inside. The code is..." "No," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not staying in a locked room in a building that's been compromised while you..." "Lyra, no." She held his gaze. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised her. Not performed, just the steadiness that came from having had everything stripped away already, from having nothing left to protect except the immediate fact of being alive and the more complicated fact of what she'd decided 3 days ago she was going to do with that. "If this goes wrong in the next 10 minutes, a locked door doesn't change anything for me. It just means I'm alone when it happens." Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. The elevator reached 48. Through the monitor, she watched the doors open and the 2 men step out into the red-amber corridor. "Then stay close," Min-jae said, "and don't make decisions without telling me you're making them." He moved back to the door. What happened in the following 12 minutes was not the kind of violence that came with clarity. It came with noise and the particular physical confusion of spaces that were too small for the number of bodies and intentions occupying them, with the smell of gunpowder in concrete stairwells, and the sound of impacts that carried weight behind them. Min-jae moved through it with the terrible efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that the choreography had become automatic. Not reckless, not spectacular, just the precise application of force to specific points at specific moments, the way a surgeon used a scalpel rather than an axe. Lyra stayed close. She did 3 things in those 12 minutes that she would not fully process until later. She pulled a fire extinguisher from a wall bracket in the utility corridor and used it to disable a man who came through a door she and Min-jae had not anticipated. She found a phone on the floor, dropped, cracked screen but functional, and used it to pull up the building schematics from a publicly available architectural filing she remembered seeing in the property documentation she'd reviewed in the context of the financial traces on the flash drive, which told her there was a secondary utility exit at basement level that didn't appear on the compromised security desk system because it had been added during a renovation 8 years prior and never updated in the building's official plans. And she communicated this to Min-jae in approximately 15 words while he was occupied with a situation in the stairwell that required his complete physical attention. He processed the 15 words and changed direction. They reached the basement exit. It opened onto a maintenance alley on the building's north side. Uncovered, cold, the November sky above them sharp and star-clear in the way it gets after snow, every edge too precise. They came out moving fast, and then Min-jae pulled her against the alley wall, and they both stood breathing for a moment, just breathing, the cold air hitting the back of her throat like something structural. She became aware that her left hand was shaking. Not dramatically, just a fine, consistent tremor that she could feel when she pressed her palm flat against the brick wall behind her. Her body's invoice for the last 12 minutes arriving slightly delayed. Min-jae checked the alley in both directions. Then his phone, a different phone from the one she'd seen earlier, something he'd produced from somewhere in the utility level. He made a call, 30 seconds of Korean, ended it. 3 minutes, he said. She didn't ask for what. They stood in the alley, and she watched him. The controlled quality of his breathing, the way he held himself against the wall with an efficiency of posture that used nothing it didn't need, and thought about the monitor room and the lobby camera and the 3 vehicles on the street and the particular patience with which Ethan's people had arranged themselves around the building. She thought about 12 minutes and a fire extinguisher and a renovation filing she'd read 6 days ago in a completely different context. She thought, I am not who I was before that restaurant table. She didn't know yet if that was survivable. The car arrived. They moved. Min-jae took her to a secondary location, an apartment, not a penthouse, 12 floors in a building in Mapogu that had no visible connection to anything she'd seen in his organizational structure, the kind of safe house that existed precisely because its connection to him was untraceable. 2 rooms, functional furniture, windows that overlooked a residential street where children had chalked something on the pavement that the morning snow had partially preserved. They arrived at 4 in the morning. She sat on the edge of the bed in the second room and pressed both palms flat on her thighs and breathed until the tremor in her left hand stopped. She heard Min-jae in the main room, the low sound of calls being made and received, the particular rhythm of a man managing the aftermath of a crisis from a remove. At some point, the call stopped. She heard him move to the window. Then stillness. She got up and went to the doorway. He was standing at the window with his back to her, looking at the residential street below. The city here was quieter than the penthouse. Domestic quiet, the quiet of people sleeping rather than the quiet of people managing power. His dress shirt had a tear at the shoulder she didn't remember from earlier. There was blood on his right forearm from something in the stairwell that he hadn't mentioned and she hadn't asked about. You knew this was a possibility, she said, that the building could be compromised. I knew it as a theoretical risk. You didn't know about the 2 men on his payroll. A pause. No, he said. How long had they been in place? Based on what I've been told in the last hour, 18 months. He didn't turn from the window, which means they were placed before I began building the Beck files seriously, which means Beck placed them speculatively, covering known potential threats before specific intelligence existed. Which means he's been watching you for longer than you've been watching him. Another pause. Yes, Min-jae said. Lyra leaned against the door frame. How much does he know about what you have? Unknown. He turned from the window. His face in the apartment's low light was tired. Actually tired, the real kind, not the managed version she'd seen at the penthouse. The controlled surface was still there, but it was running on less resource than usual. The men on his payroll were in building security, not in my working spaces. Their access was to building systems, entry logs, elevator controls. He paused. Not to files. Not to files as of what you currently know. He looked at her. Yes, he said, as of what I currently know. She moved into the room and sat down on the low couch and pulled her knees up and looked at the middle distance and let herself be tired for a moment. Actually tired, the way she hadn't allowed herself to be tired in 4 days because there hadn't been room for it yet. The gala, she said. 3 days. Still viable, he said. More viable in some ways. Tonight confirms Ethan is moving ahead of his original schedule, which means he's concerned. Concerned people make choices they haven't fully architected. Or they make choices that are more aggressive than the ones they had planned. Both things, he said. Yes. She looked at him. Tell me something true, she said. Something you haven't told me yet. He was quiet. About what? He said. About the gala. About what you're actually planning. Because there are at least 3 things you've not said directly that I can infer from what you have said and what I've seen in the files, and I need to know if my inferences are right before I walk into that ballroom. He sat down in the chair across from her. The first time she'd seen him sit with actual weight behind it, not the calibrated placement of someone maintaining an operational posture. The evidence alone is insufficient, he said. Even combined, even authenticated. The prosecutor problem is real and replicable. Baek can destroy a prosecution the way he destroyed the last one. Any legal approach fails while his institutional leverage is intact. So the gala is not about presenting evidence. The gala is about simultaneous exposure, he said. There are 7 members of the attending list who have been operating under Baek's protection because Baek holds specific leverage over each of them, private leverage, the kind that keeps men compliant without contracts. If those 7 men believe the protection is gone, that the leverage will be exposed regardless, that compliance no longer offers any protection, they have reasons to cooperate that a prosecution cannot create. You're going to make them believe Baek is already finished, she said, before he is. I'm going to make them believe it in a room together, in public, in front of each other, he said, which is different from making them believe it individually. Men are braver about their own safety in groups. Lyra thought about this. That requires a performance, she said. Yes. In a ballroom full of people who want me arrested. Beside me, he said, which, as I told you, makes me untouchable. I know. She looked at him. That's a very large bet on the power of your reputation. My reputation, he said, has never been wrong in 13 years. There's a first time. There is, he said. Yes. The apartment was quiet. From the street below, very faintly, she could hear a truck going through the dawn delivery route, the specific rumble of something heavy on pre-dawn roads. She thought about the monitor room and the cameras in the lobby floor and the 4 tactical figures moving with patience through a building she'd been living in, and she thought about a stairwell and a fire extinguisher and a renovation filing, and she thought about the moment in the alley behind the maintenance exit when she'd pressed her palm against the brick wall and felt the tremor in her left hand. She thought, I have nothing left to be afraid of losing. She thought, that is either a very free position or a very dangerous one. Okay, she said, tell me how the performance works. The next 2 days moved differently than the 4 days at the penthouse had. They worked in compressed sessions at the apartment's small table with laptops and printouts and the kind of focused intensity that comes from people who know the deadline is real and the margin is 0. Min-jae walked her through the 7 names, who they were, what Baek held over each of them, what public posture each would be performing at the gala versus what private terror they would be managing underneath it. She walked him through the financial architecture from the drive one more time, this time not as documentation, but as a performance script. What to reference, how to reference it, what to let be seen versus what to weaponize at the right moment. Between sessions, they moved around each other in the small apartment with a careful attention that neither of them addressed directly. He brought food from a place 2 blocks away that he apparently knew by name. She made coffee in the apartment's minimal kitchen and left a cup on his side of the table without asking if he wanted it, which he always did. She found, on the second morning, a clean coat hanging by the door in a style and size that fit her, and looked at it for a moment before putting it on, and he said nothing, which was the right response. They did not talk about the penthouse again. They did not talk about what he'd started to say. I don't operate that way with people who, before the phone interrupted him. But they both knew it was in the room, the same way you knew about a load-bearing wall even when you weren't looking at it. The night before the gala, Lyra sat at the table alone at 2 a.m. and went through the 7 names again while Min-jae slept. Actually slept. She could hear it from the other room, the quiet, regular breathing of someone who had decided the morning required capacity and was being disciplined about acquiring it. She went through the names and the leverage and the performance script and made notes in the margins of the printouts in the cramped handwriting she'd developed over years of annotating financial documents in tight margins. Then she put the pen down and looked at the wall. She thought about 3 years. About the apartment she'd shared with Ethan in Seongdong-gu with its particular morning light and the coffee routine they'd built over 2 years and the trip to Jeju she'd planned last summer that he'd found a reason to cancel. She thought about the things she hadn't examined because there had always been a reasonable explanation available, and she had always been slightly too tired and slightly too invested to do the examination properly. She thought, I knew. Not the specifics, not the criminal architecture, not the money, not the names. But the particular wrongness of certain silences, the specific pattern of information that arrived at exactly the moment she needed it to make a decision, and arrived in exactly the form that made the decision easy. She had known that pattern was wrong. She had chosen to interpret it as fortunate rather than managed. She had been complicit in her own blindness. She thought, that ends now. She was still sitting at the table when dawn came through the apartment's windows, pale and specific, the kind of dawn that had nothing to offer except light and time. She heard Min-jae wake, the particular sequence of sounds from the other room that constituted a person going from unconscious to operational, unhurried but complete. She heard him go to the window, which she'd come to understand was a morning constant. Then he came to the doorway of the main room. He looked at her, at the annotated printouts, at the cold coffee she'd stopped drinking 2 hours ago. You didn't sleep, he said. No. He didn't offer a judgment on this. Moved to the kitchen. She heard water running. Min-jae, she said. He stopped. Tonight, she said. If it goes wrong, not tactically, I mean if the larger thing goes wrong, if the 7 names don't move the way we think they will, if Ethan has something we haven't accounted for, Lyra. I need to know you have an exit that isn't contingent on the performance working. He came back to the doorway. Looked at her with the particular quality of attention she'd come to depend on in a way she hadn't fully acknowledged. I always have an exit, he said. For yourself, she said. I need to know there's one for me. Something moved in his face. Yes, he said. There's one for you. She nodded. He went back to the kitchen. She picked up the pen and made one more note in the margin of the page in front of her, and the note said, Ethan knew about the Bake Hospitality connection before I did. He directed me to the shell companies in week 3. Why? She stared at the note, her pen pressed against the paper. She thought about the sequencing of her 7-week discovery. The legitimate traces she'd found herself in the first 2 weeks, the offshore account pattern, the transfer architecture, the initial shell company map, and then week 3, when the file load had felt suddenly easier, when documents she'd expected to spend weeks locating had appeared in her search results with a convenience she'd attributed to improving her search methodology. He had been feeding her. Not just leaving planted documentation for her to find eventually, actively directing her research path in real time, watching her methodology and inserting the fabricated material at exactly the points where it would integrate seamlessly with the real findings. Which meant he had access to her search activity. Which meant someone inside the firm had been watching her terminal remotely for at least 5 weeks before the restaurant table. She stood up. The chair scraped back too fast and hit the wall behind it, and Min-jae was in the doorway in 3 seconds, reading her face. What? He said. He watched me find it, she said. He didn't just plant documents and wait for me to arrive at them. He was monitoring my search activity in real time and directing my path. She held his gaze. Which means there is a technical record. Every search I ran from the firm's system, every document I accessed, every query I built, There is a complete record of my actual discovery path that exists independently of the flash drive, held on the firm's servers. Min-jae was very still. If that record is pulled, she said, it proves which material I found myself and which material was inserted. It's a direct authentication of the real evidence versus the fabricated evidence. It makes the prosecution problem solvable even through compromised channels, because it's a technical record that predates Ethan's narrative. It's on the firm's servers, Min-jae said. Yes. Which are controlled by the firm, she said, which is 40% owned by a holding company that traces to Baek Sung-il, Min-jae said. Yes. They looked at each other. We need that record before the gala, she said, before tonight. It's 9 in the morning, he said. I know. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. 12 minutes later, after a call that involved 3 separate conversations in rapid succession, he set the phone down on the table and said, I have someone inside the firm's IT infrastructure, a technical contractor with legitimate access. Getting to the server partition where that record would be stored requires elevated permissions he doesn't have by default, but can acquire through a specific system vulnerability that's been... He paused. That's been known to my organization for 8 months and not used because using it would alert the firm's security team. So using it now burns a resource, she said. Using it now burns a resource and alerts their security team, which alerts Ethan, which tells him we know about the server record, which gives him approximately 6 hours before the gala to either destroy the record or use the information to adapt tonight's approach. Lyra stood at the table with her palms flat on the printouts. She thought about the 7 names and the performance and the exit Min-jae had promised, and the record on a server partition in a firm whose building she would never safely enter again. She thought, if the record is there and we don't have it, tonight is built on a foundation that Ethan can remove. She thought, if we take it and he knows we know, tonight becomes something different than the thing we planned. She thought, there is no clean version of this. She thought, there never was. Take the record, she said. Alert them. Let Ethan know we know. She lifted her eyes from the printouts to Min-jae's face. Let him walk into that ballroom tonight knowing that we have everything. Let him be afraid for once. Min-jae looked at her. Something in his face did the thing she had no name for yet. That fissure, that brief and uncontrolled arrival of something from below the managed surface, something that lived in the part of him that hadn't been filed down by a decade of operating in the dark. All right, he said. He made the call. And 6 blocks away, in a glass tower on Yoido, a server partition was accessed by a technical contractor with elevated permissions acquired through a vulnerability that had been kept in reserve for 8 months, and a complete record of Lyra Vale's search activity over 7 weeks was extracted and transmitted in 4 encrypted segments to a phone in Mapo-gu. And the firm's security system registered the intrusion and flagged it, and the flag went to a desk, and the desk sent an alert, and the alert reached a phone, and the phone was in Ethan Reeves' hand before Min-jae had even ended his call. Lyra watched Min-jae set the phone down. He knows, she said. He knows, Min-jae confirmed. How long before he adapts? Well, like 6 hours, he said. Then we have 6 hours to be ready for whatever he builds instead. Outside the apartment windows, Seoul went about its Tuesday morning with complete indifference. A child on the street below stopped beside the chalk drawing on the pavement and looked at what the snow had done to it, and then looked up at the sky as if considering whether to draw it again. Lyra watched the child for a moment. Then she turned from the window and looked at Min-jae and said, Tell me everything you know about the Imperial Aurora Hotel's internal security layout, every entrance, every exit, every blind spot in the camera coverage. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. We're not walking into a performance anymore. She picked up the pen. We're walking into a trap, she said, and we need to be the ones who built it. Min-jae sat down across from her. For the first time in 4 days, she watched him do something she had not seen his face do before. Something small, something that arrived without management and stayed for a half-second longer than he probably intended. He smiled. Not the ghost, not the implication, the actual thing. And it was, she thought, the most dangerous thing she had seen in a building full of armed men and red emergency lighting and a stairwell that had wanted to kill her. More dangerous than any of that, in a way she was not ready to examine directly. Not yet. Not with 6 hours on the clock and a ballroom full of enemies waiting at the end of them. She looked down at the paper, began to draw the hotel layout from memory. And the city kept moving outside, indifferent and beautiful and merciless, the way it always had been, the way it always would be, turning on its axis with complete disregard for the specific human beings inside it who were about to discover, in the gilded interior of the Imperial Aurora Hotel, that the most dangerous trap was always the one you walked into. The hotel rose against the November night like something that had decided to be permanent. Imperial Aurora. 40 stories of steel and glass on Tehran Row, its facade lit from below in warm amber that made it look dignified against the black sky. The kind of building that had been designed to make the people inside it feel like the architecture itself endorsed their importance. A red carpet still ran from the main entrance to the curb, where black cars arrived in careful succession, depositing men in dark suits and women in silk, all of them moving with the specific unhurriedness of people who had never once in their lives needed to hurry for anything. Lyra sat in the back of a car parked 2 blocks north and looked at the building through the window and breathed. She was wearing black silk, a gown that had arrived at the Mapogu apartment at 4 in the afternoon in a garment bag carried by a woman who said nothing, handed it over, and left. It fit precisely. She had not asked how he knew her measurements, and he had not explained it, which was its own kind of answer. Her hair was up. The cut above her eyebrow had faded to something the makeup covered. Her feet were in heels that she had already calculated she could remove in under 4 seconds if the situation required it. Beside her, Min-jae was looking at his phone. He had not looked at her when she'd come out of the apartment's small bathroom in the gown. He had looked at the point just past her left shoulder for approximately 2 seconds and then back at his phone. And she had filed this away under the category of things she was not examining until there was time to examine them. "The record is confirmed authenticated," he said. "My technical team finished verification an hour ago. The search history is clean and complete. 7 weeks of your actual discovery path, time-stamped, unaltered. Where does it sit now? 4 separate encrypted locations, one of which is with a journalist at the Korea Financial Times who has been building an independent corruption story for 11 months, and who received an anonymous package this afternoon that I expect will alter the direction of his next 3 years." He paused. "If tonight produces nothing else, the record exists, and it's outside any system Beck can reach." Lyra looked at the hotel. "He knows we have it," she said. "Yes. Which means he walked into that building tonight knowing his frame is broken." "Yes. Which means whatever he's doing in there, it isn't the plan he arrived with last week." "No," Min-jae said. "It isn't." She turned to look at him directly. In the car's interior, in the dark, with Seoul's ambient light coming through the windows and casting everything in that shifting urban chiaroscuro, he looked like what he was. A man who had been building toward something for 10 years and was now 300 meters from the end of it, with every variable in play simultaneously and no clean outcome guaranteed. "What's his most likely adaptation?" she said. "He knows the financial evidence is secured and authenticated. He knows the fabrication in the flash drive is now distinguishable from the real material. He knows the prosecution angle, even the corrupted version, is significantly weakened." Min-jae set the phone face down on his knee. "His leverage is gone, which leaves him one operational option." She waited. "Remove the problem at its source," Min-jae said. "Tonight. Publicly enough that it sends a message to anyone considering cooperation, and fast enough that the authenticated record becomes a posthumous document with no living witness to contextualize it." The word posthumous landed in the car's interior with its full weight. "He's going to try to kill me in the ballroom," she said. "Or me," Min-jae said. "Or both. He needs us both gone before the 7 names have an opportunity to move." He looked at her. "Which is why I told you this was a trap we were walking into. And the trap we built instead is predicated on him making that decision," Min-jae said. "On him committing to it visibly enough that the 7 names see it happen. Because the moment he moves against us in a room full of his father's protected assets, he paused. He demonstrates exactly what kind of protection his father actually offers. She looked at him. You want them to watch him fail, she said. I want them to watch him choose, Min-jae said. The failure is secondary. The choice is what breaks the leverage. Men stay compliant when they believe the protection is absolute and invisible. The moment the protection becomes visible and fallible, he stopped. They make different calculations. The car was quiet for a moment. Outside, another black car arrived at the hotel entrance and deposited two men in dark suits who were greeted at the door with the specific warmth reserved for important guests, which was the warmth of people being professionally reminded of their own importance. What do you need me to do? Lyra said. What you've been doing for 4 days, he said. Read the room. Tell me which of the 7 are moving toward fear and which are holding. If any of them approach you directly, let them. Let them, he confirmed. And remember that every conversation you have in there is a performance for an audience that includes people who would rather see you arrested than hear what you have to say. He paused. So say everything worth saying loudly enough to be overheard. She looked at the hotel one more time. She thought about Ethan in there, his particular ease in formal settings, the way he moved through rooms full of important people as if the room had been arranged around him. The smile that she had spent 3 years interpreting as warmth and now understood was something else entirely. Not warmth, not even its imitation, just the functional output of a person who had learned early that a convincing smile was more efficient than a weapon in most of the situations that mattered. She thought, he has never once been afraid of me. She thought, tonight that changes. Ready, she said. Min-jae opened the car door. The cold hit her immediately. Sharp November, the kind that found the gaps in formal wear with targeted precision. She felt it at her wrists, her throat, the exposed back of her neck above the gown's neckline. She breathed it in and let it settle, and then they were moving toward the hotel entrance and the red carpet and the warm amber light and the carefully arranged smiles of the people paid to make everyone feel important. The lobby of the Imperial Aurora was marble and warmth, and the particular orchestrated perfection of an event that had been planned by people whose professional reputation depended on nothing going wrong. Chandeliers, string quartet in the mezzanine, the smell of flowers and warm air, and 100 different expensive fragrances converging into something that was almost overwhelming after 2 days in a Mapogu apartment that smelled of coffee and printer paper. They entered together. The room noticed. Not explosively, not the movie version of a room going silent, the subtler version, which was in some ways more significant. A ripple of redirection, of conversations pausing mid-sentence while peripheral vision processed something and sent it forward to full attention. Of people who had been looking at each other, starting to look slightly past each other. She could feel it moving through the lobby, the way you felt a pressure change before a storm arrived, the specific atmospheric shift of a room recalibrating around a new variable. Min-jae felt it too. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, which didn't change, which was, she understood, exactly the response it was designed to produce. His stillness was a language the room already knew how to read. She walked beside him and kept her spine straight and her face in the register she'd decided on in the car. Not performance, not coldness, not the social armor of a woman trying to project safety. Just the particular clarity of someone who had run out of things to pretend and found the experience clarifying. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who knew everything. The first of the 7 names materialized within 4 minutes. Cho Byung-wook. 60. Financial sector, with a portfolio that touched 3 of the shell companies in Lyra's real discovery path, and a private arrangement with Baek Sung-il involving the concealment of a medical malpractice settlement that had ended a career in a different industry 12 years prior. He was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore his importance in his posture rather than his expression. He appeared at Lyra's left shoulder at the champagne table with the specific calibrated casualness of someone who had decided to be somewhere and was performing spontaneity. "Miss Vale," he said in accented English, "I understand you've had an eventful week." She looked at him directly. "Mr. Cho," she said, "I understand you have an eventful few months ahead of you." A pause. Very brief. His champagne glass didn't move, but his hand around it did. The specific micro-adjustment of a person who has received a communication they weren't prepared for. Min-jae was 3 feet away, speaking to someone else, but she knew. She had learned his peripheral attention in 4 days, that he had registered every syllable. I wonder, Cho said, lower now, the casualness evaporating, whether you understand the position you're in tonight. I wonder the same about you, she said. She picked up her champagne glass and moved away from the table with the same unhurriedness she'd learned from him, from Min-jae, the language of people who moved through rooms at their own pace because they had decided the room was theirs to move through. Behind her, she heard Cho set his glass down. The ballroom proper was through a set of open doors off the lobby. Grand, column-lined, a dance floor no one was using yet, and tables arranged around its perimeter, and a small elevated stage at the far end where the charitable portion of the evening would eventually deposit itself. Crystal and candlelight and the kind of acoustic warmth that meant the room had been specifically designed to make conversations feel private while actually broadcasting everything to anyone positioned correctly. She found positions 2 and 3 within the first 20 minutes. A woman named Ha Soo-jin, who ran a mid-tier investment advisory firm, and whose connection to the Beck financial structure ran through the hospitality shell companies in a way that Ha had probably believed was adequately buried. And a man she knew only as Director Lim, whose title she'd found on a government registry filing and whose presence at the gala meant his directorship was being used as cover for something the registry filing had not disclosed. She spoke to both of them, briefly, precisely, in the language of someone who knew exactly what she knew and wasn't in a hurry to explain the implications, because the implications were self-evident to anyone who understood what she was referring to. Both conversations ended with the other person finding a reason to be somewhere else. Good. She was moving toward the 4th name, a younger man, late 30s, who handled the insurance architecture for 3 of the Beck businesses, when she saw Ethan. He was across the ballroom, near the stage, in a dark charcoal suit that she had helped him choose 14 months ago from a tailor in Sinsadong. He was speaking to 2 men she didn't recognize, and from this distance, his face was exactly what it always was in rooms like this. Open, warm, the practiced accessibility of a man who understood that likability was a professional tool. Then he looked up. Across the ballroom floor, through the candlelight and the moving bodies, and the string quartet that had relocated to the ground floor and was providing a musical backdrop to everything with complete thematic indifference. He looked directly at her. The warmth left his face, not replaced by anger, not replaced by fear, just emptied. The way a room looked after someone had taken everything out of it, and you could see for the first time how the walls were actually built. 3 seconds. Then he looked away and went back to his conversation and laughed at something one of the men said. Lyra's heartbeat had gone up. She registered it, noted it, breathed through it. She found Min-jae at her shoulder. He's seen you, Min-jae said, not looking at her. Yes. The 2 men he's speaking to left of the stage, the taller one. She looked without appearing to look, a habit she'd developed in the last 4 days without noticing she was developing it. I don't recognize him, she said. Yoon Tae-sik, Min-jae said. He manages security operations for Baek Sung-il's private assets. His presence here is not on the publicly available guest list. He brought muscle to a charity gala. He brought a specific kind of muscle, Min-jae said, the kind that doesn't register on building security scanners. The implication arrived cleanly. Where's Baek Sung-il, she said. 3rd table from the right, the man in the gray suit speaking to the woman in red. She found him without difficulty. 63, the files had said, and the files were accurate. He was trim, unhurried, with the kind of face that had long since stopped needing to perform authority and had simply become it. He was laughing at something the woman in red had said. He had not looked toward the entrance since they'd arrived. He already knew they were there. His lack of attention was deliberate. He's leaving Ethan to manage it, she said. Ethan is his instrument in this, Min-jae said. Beck doesn't move directly on operational matters. He never has. It's part of why prosecution has always failed. There's sufficient distance between his decisions and their execution that evidence chains break before they reach him. Yoon Tae-sik is Ethan's authorization, she said. Yes. Then we need to move Ethan before Ethan moves us. Min-jae was quiet for half a second. Give me 6 minutes, he said. He moved away from her into the crowd with the unhurried certainty of a man who had identified his direction and found everything between him and it irrelevant. Lyra found the fourth name. The insurance architect was young enough that his fear was less hidden than the older guests. It lived closer to his surface, visible in the way his eyes moved too fast across the room when she introduced herself, and in the way he laughed when nothing had been said that warranted it. She spoke to him for 3 minutes. She told him what she knew about his connection to the hospitality shell companies. She told him, quietly, clearly, in the same register she'd used to read a quarterly report, that this information existed in authenticated, secured documentation in 4 locations outside any system the Beck organization could access, and that the decision facing him in the next few hours was not whether this information would reach the relevant authorities, but whether he was mentioned in it as a passive participant or an active collaborator. He put his champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray with slightly too much force. "What do you want?" he said. "Nothing from you tonight," she said. "Just for you to know what exists." She moved away. 4 minutes had passed. She was looking for 5 and 6 when she felt a hand on her arm. Not rough, just a specific grip. The kind that wanted to be read as social and wasn't. She turned. Ethan. Up close, without the ballroom distance, his face was doing something more complicated than the empty thing she'd seen from across the room. There was something working in his jaw. In the particular way his eyes had gone to a steadier register than the social warmth he'd been performing. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision and was now on the descending side of it, past the moment of choosing and into the mechanics of execution. "Walk with me," he said. "I don't think so." "Lyra." His voice was very low. The grip on her arm stayed exactly where it was. "There are things you don't understand about tonight." "There are things you don't understand about tonight," she said. Something moved in his eyes. "You think he can protect you," Ethan said. "You think because you walked in here with him, because his name is attached to you right now, that makes you safe." A pause. Half a beat. "He can't protect you. He couldn't protect his own building 3 nights ago. He barely got you out of there." Is that a statement of fact or a claim of credit? His grip tightened slightly. "Walk with me," he said again. "Let go of my arm," she said, "or I will make a scene in front of every person in this room who matters to your father's operation, and we can both watch what happens to the room temperature when I do." A long pause. He let go. She looked at him, the man she had planned a life with, the man who had spent 3 years calibrating himself to her perception with the patience and precision of something she did not have a clean word for. She looked at him and felt the expected things, the anger, the retrospective disgust, the deep cold fury of someone who had been comprehensively deceived by a person she'd chosen to trust. And underneath all of it, very quiet and very honest, a specific grief not for him, but for the 3 years she had lived inside the version of events he'd constructed. 3 years of her life. Well spent, she thought, on something that had made her capable of everything that had happened since. "You were supposed to be mine," he said, the exact words she'd been waiting for. "Say that again," she said, loudly. He stared at her. "Say it again," she said, at a volume that carries. 3 feet to her right, she registered movement. The insurance architect, who had not yet left the immediate area, was now looking at them. Beyond him, Ha Soo-jin had stopped her own conversation. Director Lim had turned. Ethan read the room. His eyes moved fast across the faces that had oriented toward them, and she watched him process it. The visibility, the witnesses, the specific architecture of the moment she'd built around him in the 35 seconds since he'd touched her arm. "You set this up," he said. "I walked into a room and talked to people," she said. "You put your hand on my arm and said something revealing in a space with significant ambient attention. That's not a setup. That's a consequence." The hand that had been on her arm went to his jacket's interior, and everything in the room changed. She didn't see it so much as feel it. The specific atmospheric shift of people in a social space processing the visual signal of a hand going to an interior pocket in a manner that was different from reaching for a phone or a business card. A sound change, the string quartet seeming suddenly very distant. Two people in her immediate peripheral vision stepping back not consciously, but with the instinctive recoil of bodies receiving a threat signal they hadn't consciously identified yet. Then Min-jae's voice directly behind Ethan. "I wouldn't." Ethan went completely still. Min-jae was close, very close. She could see from her angle that his right hand was not visible, was behind Ethan, at a position she understood without needing it explained. His face was the controlled surface, the flat affect, but she knew it now well enough to read underneath it, and underneath it was something that had been building for 14 months, and had arrived here in a ballroom in a building called the Imperial Aurora, and was not performing. "We're in public," Ethan said. Very quiet. "Yes," Min-jae said. "You won't—" "I've done significantly more considered things in more observed spaces," Min-jae said. "You of all people have access to documentation confirming this." A beat. 2 beats. The room was not silent. The string quartet played on, conversations continued at a distance, waiters moved through with trays, but in the specific 7-foot radius around the three of them, everything had gone to a register of suspended decision. Then Ethan's hand came out of his jacket. Empty. He took a step back from Min-jae, which put him closer to Lyra, and for a moment the geometry of it was such that she could see both their faces simultaneously. Ethan's, which had arrived at something that was not quite calculation and not quite resignation, a third thing that lived between them. And Min-jae's, which was completely and utterly steady in the way that things were steady when they had decided. "This doesn't end here," Ethan said. "No," Min-jae said. "It doesn't." Then across the ballroom, from the direction of the main doors, a sound moved through the room like a hand pulled across the surface of still water, the specific collective intake and redirect of 200 people's attention orienting toward a single point. She looked. The main doors of the ballroom had opened, not the service staff, not a late guest, and 4 men entered in dark clothing that the room immediately understood was not formal wear, and behind them, visible for exactly 3 seconds before the room began producing the first sounds of a panic that hadn't yet decided what it was, a flash of light. Then the window nearest the stage exploded inward. The sound arrived a half-second after the light. Not the rolling explosion of something large, but the sharp percussive crack of something precise, directional, and it took the glass out of its frame and threw it across 15 feet of ballroom floor and sent every person in the immediate vicinity to the ground or the nearest table in the pure animal shortcut of bodies reacting before minds could. The string quartet stopped. Lyra dropped. Not consciously. Her knees hit the floor before the thought of dropping had fully arrived, and she was moving sideways behind the nearest table with the marble-topped chair between her and the broken window, and her heels gone because she'd executed the 4-second removal in approximately 1.5 without registering doing it. Around her, the ballroom became 200 different versions of the same decision. Hide or run, freeze or move, the entire evolutionary calculus of human beings in sudden danger playing out simultaneously in silk gowns and dark suits across marble floors. She looked for Min-jae. He was standing. He was the only person in the immediate area who was standing, which would have been insane under almost any other assessment of the situation, except that she understood now, with the clarity of 4 days of proximity, that his stillness was not the paralysis of shock, but the exact opposite. The compressed readiness of someone whose system had moved past the alarm phase and into the operational phase before the glass had finished hitting the floor. He was looking at the 4 men by the main doors, who were looking at him. Yoon Tae-sik was visible behind them, near the stage, with the particular composure of a man who had planned this and was watching it execute. Ethan was not visible. She scanned for him across the chaos of the ballroom floor, the overturned chairs, the people pressed against walls and under tables, the waitstaff who had made it to service exits, the 2 women near the stage who were still standing with the specific suspended incomprehension of people whose brains had not yet issued the update, and could not find him. He was gone. She looked at Min-jae. He looked at her. He said, across 6 feet of ballroom floor and the sound of a fire suppression system beginning to engage somewhere in the hotel's infrastructure, with complete calm, as if they were still in the apartment at the small table with the printouts between them. North Service Corridor, 3rd door on the left. She looked at the room. at the four men by the main door who were now moving inward, at Yoon Tae-sik near the stage who was watching Min-jae with the expression of a man about to give an instruction. She looked at the north wall. She moved. Bare feet on marble, gown gathered in her right hand, she crossed the 15 feet to the north wall with her head down and her body below the line of the overturned table barrier, and hit the service door at full speed and went through it into a corridor that was concrete and fluorescent and blessedly, brutally ordinary after the ballroom's orchestrated grandeur. She went to the third door on the left, tried it, locked. She pressed herself against the wall beside it and looked back toward the ballroom door and breathed and thought and counted. 4 men main door, Yoon Tae-sik stage side, Ethan not visible, Min-jae standing in the open ballroom between her and all of it. The door burst open from the inside. Min-jae came through it moving fast, which was the first time she had seen him move fast. And the difference between his normal compressed efficiency and this was significant enough that her body read it as information before her mind did. He pulled the door shut behind him. In the corridor's fluorescent light, she could see blood on his left forearm. Fresh, bright, the specific visual of something recent, and his right hand was occupied with something she'd been aware of in a general sense for 4 days without ever seeing directly until now. "How many?" she said. "The 4 from the main door contained," he said. "Yoon Tae-sik has moved east. He has at least 2 additional men in the building's east wing." He looked at her. "Ethan went for the roof." "Why the roof?" "Because there's an extraction point on the roof he set up 6 hours ago," Min-jae said, "which means there's something on the roof he intends to leave with." She stared at him. "What's on the roof?" she said. He held her gaze. "You," he said. If tonight had gone his way. The corridor was very quiet. From the ballroom behind them, muffled by the service door, she could hear the sounds of 200 people in controlled chaos, the distant authority of hotel security beginning to assert itself, and somewhere in the hotel's infrastructure, the fire suppression system cycling through its sequence. "The stairs," she said. "Lyra, where are the stairs to the roof?" He looked at her. The controlled surface, the 10 years of it, the thing built on the foundation of a shipping logistics business in Incheon, and a decision made by a 19-year-old who had found his father in the ruins of something a man like Baek Sung-il had considered collateral management. She looked back at him. "If he gets off this roof," she said, "the record doesn't matter. The 7 names don't matter. He disappears with Baek's money and Baek's protection, and in 6 months I'm still a murder suspect, and you're still building files for another 14 months, and nothing we did tonight means anything." A pause. "The stairs," she said. "Where?" Min-jae looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and moved down the corridor. She followed. The stairwell at the corridor's end was concrete and cold, utilitarian, the kind of infrastructure that existed for emergencies and was never otherwise used. Their footsteps echoed. His shoes, her bare feet, in a way that made the ascent feel more exposed than it was. 12 floors to the roof access from their current level. She counted landings and breathed and watched the blood on his forearm and said nothing about it. At the 39th floor landing, he stopped, held up a hand. She stopped. Above them, through the concrete ceiling of the stairwell, she could hear footsteps on the final run of stairs. 1 set, moving with the particular cadence of someone who believed they were alone. Min-jae looked up, then at her. "He's not alone," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "He came in tonight with Yoon's men," Min-jae said, just as quietly. "He doesn't go anywhere alone." "Then whoever's ahead of us, that's the advance. Going to confirm the extraction point is clear." He paused. "When he opens the roof door, Ethan will follow." His eyes came down to hers. "Which gives us 45 seconds between the advance clearing and Ethan arriving at this landing." She looked up the last stairwell run, then at him. "Go," she said. He went. 12 steps, fast. Silent in a way that defied the physics of 12 steps taken fast on concrete, which told her something about what 12 years of this had done to the way he moved at a fundamental level. She followed 4 steps behind and felt the cold concrete on her bare feet and the silk of the gown against her legs and the specific clarity that arrived in her chest like cold water when everything had been stripped to its actual components and the only question left was what she was willing to do. The advance cleared the roof door. The door swung shut above them. Min-jae reached the landing and pressed against the wall beside the door. She reached the landing. They stood on either side of the door in the concrete quiet, and she could hear her own heartbeat clearly. Not racing, not the panicked rhythm of the alley 4 nights ago, but something different, a harder and more deliberate beat, the heart of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the door to open. 15 seconds. 20. 30. The door handle moved, and Ethan Reeve came through the roof access door of the Imperial Aurora Hotel into a November night in Seoul that was clear and cold and full of the city's particular and different light, and found himself standing between the 2 people he had spent the last week trying to remove from a board he had believed was his to control, and understood in the 4 seconds before anything else happened that the night had gone in a direction from which Ethan stopped. 3 feet through the roof door, in the November dark, with Seoul spread out below the building's parapet in every direction like a circuit board running at full capacity. He stopped and looked at the 2 people standing on either side of him and did the calculation that his face had always done. Fast, invisible, the rapid internal accounting of a man who had spent his entire adult life finding the angle that kept him above the situation. This time the calculation took longer than usual. The roof was flat and exposed, lit from below by the building's amber exterior lighting and from above by a sky that had cleared after the earlier snow and was now brutally, uselessly beautiful. The kind of sky that arrived after cold fronts and offered visibility in all directions and hid nothing. Wind came off the Han, a few blocks south, the specific river wind that carried moisture and a degree of cold that the thermometer alone didn't account for. 30 feet from the door, a helicopter sat on the designated landing pad, rotors still, running lights dark. Beside it, the advance man stood with the specific frozen quality of someone who had looked up from a task and found a situation that no longer matched his briefing. Ethan looked at Min-jae, then at Lyra, then back at Min-jae. "You can't hold all 3 of us," he said. "I don't need to hold all 3 of you," Min-jae said. The advance man made a decision. She saw it happen. The shift in his weight, the hand going back toward the jacket, and then Min-jae moved, and what happened in the 2 seconds after that was precise and final, and the advance man was on the roof surface and not getting up immediately. And Min-jae came back to his position as if the interruption had been administrative rather than physical. His breathing adjusted by approximately nothing. Ethan looked at the advance man on the ground. The wind moved across the roof. "The helicopter doesn't matter," Lyra said. Her voice came out steady, and she was grateful for it. Not because she needed to perform steadiness, but because it was true, and she wanted the truth to be audible. "There's nowhere the helicopter takes you that the record doesn't follow. It's in 4 locations. One of them went to a journalist this afternoon. That story runs regardless of what happens on this roof." Ethan looked at her. In the amber and city light, she could see his face doing the thing it had done at the restaurant table. That settling, that adjustment, but slower this time. The calculation was slower because the board was different. The board had been reconfigured in ways he hadn't fully anticipated, and the reconfiguration was showing. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. "I understand exactly what I've done. My father, your father," Min-jae said, "is currently in a ballroom on the 31st floor of this building where 7 of his most strategically significant protected assets have spent the last 40 minutes being made aware that his protection is contingent and his operational infrastructure is documented and authenticated in ways that no prosecutor he owns can suppress." He paused. "His leverage ends tonight, not because of a court, because the men he leverages will spend tomorrow morning calculating whether compliance still costs less than cooperation." Ethan's jaw moved. "You think that's enough to finish him?" "No," Min-jae said. "It's enough to start it. The finishing takes longer. It always does." A beat. "But it starts tonight, on this roof, when you make a decision about what comes next." The wind pushed across the building's edge and the helicopter's dark rotors turned slightly without power, just the wind moving them, making a low sound like something incomplete. Ethan looked at Lyra with an expression she had never seen on him before in 3 years. Not the warmth, not the warmth's absence, something that lived underneath both of them. Something exposed by the removal of every layer he had spent years constructing, something raw and honestly ugly, and, she thought, the most truthful thing his face had produced in the entire duration of their relationship. "I did try to protect you," he said. "In the beginning, before I understood what you'd found." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Then you know it wasn't—" "It doesn't matter," she said. "What you intended in the beginning doesn't change what you did at the end. You had 2 executives killed. You built a murder frame around my name. You sent men in SUVs through the rain to collect me." She paused. The wind was cold on her bare arms, and she felt it precisely, all of it, the physical reality of the roof and the cold and the man in front of her who had been the organizing structure of her life for 3 years. Whatever you felt in the beginning ended when you made those choices. And you made those choices. Not your father, not his organization. You. Something moved through Ethan's face. Quick, gone. "What do you want from me?" he said. "I want you to call your father," Min-jae said. "Right now. In my presence. And tell him the documentation has been secured outside any system his organization can reach, and that Yoon Tae-sik and the men he brought into the Imperial Aurora tonight are going to be identified and prosecuted, and that the most productive path available to Baek Sung-il at this moment is to begin the process of disengaging from his institutional leverage before those 7 names do it for him." A pause. "If he disengages voluntarily and cooperates with the financial disclosure process that the authenticated record initiates, the criminal exposure, his personal criminal exposure, not the organization's, can be managed." Ethan stared at him. "You're offering him a deal." "I'm offering him a choice," Min-jae said. "The same choice your father gave every person he ever leveraged. The same calculation he's been asking other people to make for 30 years. His voice stayed level. Completely, precisely level. Now he makes it. The roof was quiet except for the wind and the distant city and the very faint sound of sirens that had been building from somewhere below since the ballroom window went out. Ethan looked at Lyra one more time. She looked back. She thought about the couch in the Seongdong-gu apartment and the morning light and the coffee routine and the Jeju trip and the restaurant table and his thumb on her wrist and the alley and the pavement against her cheek. She thought about all of it without flinching because flinching was for things she hadn't processed yet, and she had processed this. In 4 days at a table with printouts and cold coffee, she had processed it down to something that would scar but wouldn't kill her. "Make the call," she said. "Or don't, but you don't leave this roof until you do." Ethan reached into his jacket. Both she and Min-jae moved. Instinct, the instant same-direction recoil of 2 people who had been in a ballroom 30 minutes ago when a hand went into a jacket and it hadn't been a phone. He held up the phone. Just the phone. He looked at them both for a half-second with something that might have been, under completely different circumstances and in a completely different life, the dark humor of a man who understood the irony of the situation he'd produced. Then he made the call. The conversation was in Korean and lasted 4 minutes, and she stood on the cold roof with the city below her and Min-jae beside her and listened to the shape of it without understanding every word. The silences, the register shifts, the moment near the end when Ethan's voice dropped from the controlled tone he'd been using into something flatter and more honest. Something that sounded less like a man delivering information and more like a man conceding a position he had held for a long time. He ended the call, put the phone in his pocket. "He wants to speak to you directly," Ethan said to Min-jae. "Tomorrow, not through intermediaries." Min-jae looked at him. "Tell him he knows where to find me," Min-jae said. A silence. The sirens below had resolved into the specific pattern of multiple vehicles converging on a location. Police, she thought. And beyond that, the more complicated machinery of the investigation that the journalist's story would trigger and the financial disclosure process that the authenticated record would initiate. All of it still hours away from being visible, but already set in motion, already running its course through the city's various institutional channels, with the patient irreversibility of things that had been properly documented. "What happens to me?" Ethan said. Lyra answered before Min-jae could. "That's not my decision," she said. "Or his. The record is out. The journalist has it. The Financial Crimes Division will receive a copy through a separate channel before morning. What happens to you is what happens inside that process." She paused. The same process you tried to use against me. He nodded, slowly. The specific nod of someone absorbing a final accounting. He looked at the helicopter, then at the roof door, then at the advanced man still prone on the rooftop surface, who was moving now, pushing up to sitting with the specific careful inventory of a person checking for damage. Then back at Min-jae. The men in the ballroom, he said. Yoon Tae-sik and his team will be identified by building security cameras inside the next 3 hours, Min-jae said. Their documentation was never as clean as they believed. That's a separate process and it runs separately. Ethan absorbed this too. Then he walked to the roof door. He stopped with his hand on the handle and didn't turn around. I did love you, he said. For a while, whatever that's worth. Lyra stood on the cold roof and looked at his back and felt the full weight of the statement. The specific, complicated weight of something that was probably true and didn't change anything, not one single thing, which was its own kind of answer about the limited utility of certain truths. I know, she said. He went through the door. Min-jae stood beside her on the roof, and neither of them moved for a moment. Below, Seoul produced its endless sound, traffic and river, and the particular urban frequency of 2 million people living in physical proximity, all of it rising to the roof in a wash that was almost comforting in its indifference, the city going about its business as it always had, as it would after every human crisis conducted within its borders. The wind moved across the roof again. She became aware slowly that she was shaking, not the fine, controlled tremor from the Mapogu apartment, something deeper, the full-body shaking of a person whose nervous system was issuing the deferred invoice for everything that had happened since a restaurant table in Cheongdam-dong and a fiancé's thumb on her wrist, all of it arriving now that the immediate structure of the threat had collapsed and her body had decided it was finally allowed to register what the last 6 days had actually cost. Min-jae said nothing. He took off his jacket, placed it over her shoulders. She pulled it closed with both hands and stood in it and breathed and let the shaking run its course, because fighting it was pointless, and she had learned in the last 6 days to spend her energy on things that were not pointless. After a while, the shaking subsided. She looked at the city. Is it over? She said. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. The acute part, he said. Yes. And the rest? The rest takes months. The financial disclosure process, the investigations the record triggers, the 7 names and what they decide to do with what they know. He paused. Baek Sung-il won't move against you while he's managing the disengagement. It costs him more than it gains him. The calculation shifts. And Ethan? Will cooperate or won't, Min-jae said. The process runs either way. With him it runs faster. Without him it runs longer. The outcome doesn't substantially change. She nodded, turned from the city, and looked at him. The blood on his left forearm had darkened against his shirt. She looked at it directly for the first time. That needs attention, she said. It's manageable. That's not what I said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. The thing she had spent 6 days watching arrive and retreat. The thing that lived below the controlled surface in the part of him that hadn't been filed down. The part that had been a 19-year-old in Incheon standing in the ruins of his father's business and deciding what to become. You're right, he said. It's not. They went down from the roof. The weeks that followed moved differently than anything that had come before them. Slower, with the particular texture of aftermath. The days that existed after the acute crisis, but before the new ordinary had fully formed. Lyra moved through them with the deliberateness of someone learning to walk on ground that had recently proven it could disappear. The Korea Financial Times story ran 48 hours after the gala. The journalist, working with the server record and cross-referencing it against financial disclosures and public registry filings, produced something that took the shell company architecture Lyra had mapped over 7 weeks and explained it in terms accessible to the population of people who did not read offshore account structures for professional recreation. The story ran on the front page of the financial section and was picked up by 3 international outlets within 24 hours. The murder charges against Lyra were not dropped immediately. These things didn't drop immediately. They were reviewed, then placed under a status the legal system used when charges had been filed in circumstances that subsequent investigation had rendered complicated. The two executives were found to have died under circumstances that a forensic review conducted by investigators who were not connected to the channels Baek Sung-il had owned determined were not consistent with the original narrative. The charges moved from active to suspended to finally withdrawn, which happened on a Tuesday in December when Lyra was in a prosecutor's office in Yeouido, answering questions for the third time, and a woman entered and handed the lead investigator a document that he read twice before initiating a process Lyra had been told to expect, but had not let herself believe until it happened. She sat in the corridor outside the prosecutor's office afterward and felt nothing dramatic, just the specific quiet of a thing that had been pressing against her being removed, which was not the positive sensation it should have been in the abstract, but was simply the absence of pressure, which her body registered as nothing more than relief that it could breathe at its normal depth again. She called her father. He answered on the second ring, the way he always had. The particular immediate availability of a man who had spent her entire childhood making sure she knew there was always someone who would pick up. "Lyra, what?" he said. "Appa," she said. "The charges are gone." A silence. The kind of silence that contained several things at once. Relief and the backlog of fear that relief unlocked, and something older underneath both of those. The specific weight of a parent who had watched their child navigate something too large and could only watch from a distance. "Come home," he said. "I will," she said. "Soon." She meant it, and she didn't mean it simultaneously, which was honest if not entirely satisfying, and she thought her father understood this because he said, "Whenever you're ready, and let it be what it was." Baek Sung-il began the disengagement process in early December, which was visible only in its negative space, in things that stopped happening, in institutional pressures that relaxed in channels that had been compressed for years, in the quiet realignment of certain political calculations, as the protection that had organized them became unreliable. He was not arrested. He was not prosecuted. Not then. The machinery of that moved in the months that followed through channels that were slow and institutional and had the patient, grinding quality of processes that didn't require assistance once properly initiated. Min-jae watched it with the specific patience of a man who had learned over 10 years that watching was a form of work, that vigilance was not passive.
It was so too.
Continued to manage the empire, the hospitality businesses, the shipping interests, the network of considerations and capabilities that had been built over a decade and did not dismantle itself because an acute crisis had resolved. He began, as he had told Lyra he intended to begin, delegating pieces of it to his brothers, a process that was neither fast nor uncomplicated but was real and visible in the specific texture of his days. Lyra stayed in Seoul. This was not inevitable. She had considered returning to the United States, her original country, the country on her passport, the country where most of the professional infrastructure she'd built before Seoul existed and could theoretically be resumed. She sat with the option for 3 weeks in a short-term apartment in Yongsan-gu, which she'd moved into after the Mapogu safe house, and turned it over from multiple angles with the same systematic attention she'd given the shell company, architecture. She stayed. Not primarily because of him, though he was a factor she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge. Primarily because she had looked at the list of things that needed to be done inside Seoul's financial enforcement architecture, the gaps in documentation, the institutional channels that had been compromised and needed reconstruction, the specific technical expertise in offshore account structures and shell company mapping that was apparently rare enough that 2 different investigative bodies had found ways to communicate their interest in it, and decided that leaving was a choice available to her and not the one she wanted to make. She began consulting work in January, initially unofficial, then increasingly formal, with investigators whose mandates were legitimate and whose methods she could verify. She rebuilt the habit of financial work from the ground up, which felt different from before. Not cleaner exactly, but more honest, the difference between work done with full information and work done inside a managed illusion. She and Min-jae saw each other with a frequency that neither of them had formally structured, and neither of them addressed directly for a period of weeks that eventually ran to months. He came to the Yongsan-gu apartment sometimes for reasons that began as operational, information to exchange, questions about the financial structure she was better positioned to answer, and then gradually stopped requiring those reasons, arriving without them and not explaining the transition, which was consistent with everything else about him. She went to the penthouse sometimes. The building had been secured more comprehensively following the November breach. It felt different without the acute crisis organizing the space, larger, quieter, less like a command center and more like the place where a person lived, which was its own kind of revelation. One evening in February, she was standing in the penthouse kitchen making ramen at 11 at night, because neither of them had eaten since early afternoon, and the city outside was doing its winter thing, cold and clear, the Han silver black under the bridge lights, the particular Seoul nighttime that she had come to know in a way she hadn't come to know any city since the one she'd grown up in. She was wearing one of his shirts because it was warmer than anything she'd arrived in, and she'd stopped asking permission for this category of decision approximately 6 weeks prior without explicit discussion. He came into the kitchen behind her. She heard his footsteps. She knew the sound of his footsteps in a way that had developed without her noticing it developing, the specific rhythm of them, the slight variation in pace that corresponded to different states of preoccupation. And she knew from them that he'd been at the window in the main room, the one that looked over Seoul, the standing watching that had been a nightly constant since before she'd met him. She kept stirring. The Beck financial disclosure hearing got a date, she said. March 14th. I know, he said. My investigative contact says the evidentiary package is strong enough that the institutional interference factor is significantly reduced. The people who would normally intervene have their own exposure now. I know, he said again. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning against the counter 3 feet away with his arms crossed, watching her in the way he did sometimes. Not the operational attention, not the professional attention, the third kind, the one he'd stopped trying to manage the visibility of around the time she'd stopped needing to ask permission about his shirts. Then why are you standing there looking like you're calculating something, she said. I'm not calculating, he said. You always look like you're calculating. I'm not, he said. Right now I'm not. She turned back to the ramen. The kitchen was warm. The city was outside. The fire in the main room. There was always a fire in the main room in winter. She'd come to understand this was not atmospheric choice, but habit. Something about the sound of it crackled steadily through the doorway. The scar, she said. The one from the stairwell in November. What about it? Does it still hurt? A pause. Sometimes, he said. When it's cold. She nodded. She thought about that corridor in November. The red amber light, the concrete, the particular quality of his stillness that she had encountered for the first time and had been, without fully knowing it, learning to read ever since. She thought about the roof, about Ethan's voice saying, I did love you, for a while, about her own voice saying, I know, in a way that was true and sufficient and did not require anything more. She thought about her father's voice on the phone, come home whenever you're ready, and the way she had meant both things simultaneously and still did, though the weight had shifted between them over the months, the whenever you're ready growing heavier and the come home growing lighter, not because she loved him less, but because she had been building something here, in this city, in this work, in this specific and unlikely set of circumstances that counted as its own kind of home. She turned from the stove and leaned back against the counter and looked at Min-jae directly. He looked back. I want to ask you something, she said. All right. And I need you to answer me straight, not managed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I'll try, he said, which was, she had come to understand, the most honest version of yes available to him, given the decade of management that was built into his baseline, and was therefore the most honest thing he could say. When I asked you the first night why you really brought me up here, you started to say something. I don't operate that way with people who... And then the phone interrupted you. She held his gaze. Finish the sentence. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved over Seoul in that February way, cold and direct, no pretense. He uncrossed his arms, looked at her with the quality of attention she would never stop finding the most unsettling thing about him, total, unperformed, meeting the information without flinching from what it contained. People who look directly at me, he said. A beat. I don't operate that way with people who look directly at me. She held his gaze. Because it doesn't happen often, she said. Because it doesn't happen, he said. Historically, it doesn't happen. The fire crackled in the main room. The city moved outside. The ramen she'd made was sitting on the counter waiting for both of them with the patient indifference of food that had been prepared and could wait. She thought about the service road in November, the rain, her bare feet on a wet pavement, the specific calculus she'd made in the oldest part of her brain. Move toward the thing that looks more dangerous than what is already behind you, which had turned out to be less a survival choice and more a choosing, the way you sometimes chose things without knowing that's what you were doing until you were already on the other side of it. Min-jae, she said. He was already closer than he'd been a moment ago. She hadn't tracked the movement. It had happened in the way his movement sometimes happened, present in the result rather than the process. I'm not easy, she said. I need you to know that going in, I am not a person who… I know, he said. I have a very specific and comprehensive understanding of every way this could go wrong. So do I, he said. And I'm going to keep working, she said. The financial investigation work, it matters to me. That doesn't change. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. The tattoos above his collar, the scar at his jaw she'd catalogued on the third day at the penthouse and understood the origin of only later, the controlled surface with the fractures in it that she had learned to read like a second language over the months. The man who had built 10 years of something in the dark and had begun, slowly and with visible difficulty, to build something in the light instead. I looked at you on that service road, she said, and I thought, this is the stupidest decision I have made in a very bad night. Something happened to his face. Fully. Not the ghost, not the fraction. The complete version of what his face did when it stopped being managed. Was it? He said. She reached up and put her hand against his face. His jaw, the way he had put his hand against her cheek in the rain outside the convenience store in November. Warm in the cold. The specific warmth of a person who ran hotter than the world around him. No, she said. It was the only good one. He kissed her. Not the performed version of the thing, not gentle and careful and practiced. Just direct, the way he did everything. The way he paid attention and made decisions and moved through stairwells and read balance sheets and stood at windows watching cities that he felt responsible for in ways that couldn't be cleanly explained. Direct and present, and without the management of a person performing an emotion rather than having one. She kissed him back the same way. The ramen got cold. Neither of them addressed this for a significant amount of time. Spring came to Seoul in March. Not the dramatic announcement of it. The gradual arrival, the specific daily increment of warmth returning to a city that had been very cold for a long time. The Han losing its winter silver and going to something warmer in color as the light changed. Cherry blossoms appeared on the Yeouido Riverside Walk in the last week of March, white against gray sky. And then the sky itself changed and the blossoms were white against blue, which was a different statement entirely. The big financial disclosure hearing produced results on a timeline that the investigative contacts described as unusually rapid for the institutional machinery involved, which Lyra understood to mean that the pressure applied by the authenticated record and the removal of the leverage architecture had done its work in ways that were now visible in the absence of the usual obstructions. Baek Sung-il was present at the hearing in person, with legal representation, but not the particular legal representation that had managed his operations for 30 years, because that representation had their own exposure now and had found reasons to be elsewhere. Min-jae did not attend the hearing. He watched the reporting from the penthouse with the specific quality of a man watching a process he had initiated complete itself through means he had never been part of directly, which was, she had come to understand, precisely how it had always been designed to work. She attended. She sat in the public gallery in a dark blazer and flat shoes and watched the proceedings with the attention of someone who understood every financial instrument referenced in the documentation, which was most of them, and thought about a restaurant table in Cheongdam-dong in November and how far the distance between that table and this seat had turned out to be, measured in every possible unit. She thought about the 7 names, most of whom had made the calculation Min-jae had predicted, the shift from compliance to cooperation that happened when protection became visibly contingent. Not all of them. 2 had tried to hold. The process ran without them and would catch up with them in time, which was a fact she had made her peace with because it was a fact about how institutional processes worked rather than a fact about justice. And she had learned the difference between those two things with a specificity that no professional training could have produced. She thought about Ethan. He had cooperated. The calculation that Min-jae had predicted, cooperation costs less than resistance, had taken him approximately 10 days to reach after the roof of the Imperial Aurora. He was not in Seoul. The process had moved him through a combination of legal exposure and the particular kind of organizational abandonment that happened when a man lost his protection and discovered he had built his entire identity inside the structure of it. She did not know exactly where he was and did not pursue the information. The grief she had processed in those 4 days at the penthouse table had finished processing in the months since, leaving behind something that was not warmth and was not hatred, but was the particular flatness of a thing that had been fully seen and no longer required looking at. She thought about her father. She went to Busan in April, 2 weeks in a city that was different from Seoul in ways she felt in her body. Smaller light, quieter pace, the specific salt smell of the southern sea that she had grown up with and not thought about for years. Her father was shorter than she remembered, which was not accurate, which was just the way people appeared when you had been away long enough and returned with different eyes. He made her soup the first night because he made soup when he didn't know what else to do and had never outgrown the instinct. She sat at his kitchen table and drank soup and told him what he needed to know and left out the things that would not help him, and was honest about the line between those two categories when he asked questions that crossed it. At the end of the second week, on the last evening, he walked her to the train station the way he'd walked her to buses and trains her entire life, and stood on the platform with the specific posture of a man who had learned to release his daughter into a world that sometimes produced genuinely terrible situations and had not been defeated by this. "The man in Seoul," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Is he—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Are you safe? Not is he a good man, not does he deserve you." The one question that had always been his first question for every person who had occupied a significant position in her life. The question that was simple and complete. "Yes," she said, "I'm safe." He nodded. "Then that's enough for me to start with," he said. The train came. She came back to Seoul in the last week of April, on a warm evening when the city was operating with the specific energy of a place that had just remembered. It could be warm, and was finding this delightful. The outdoor restaurants full and the Han walking paths crowded and the particular social looseness of a cold city entering spring. She came back to the penthouse. Min-jae opened the door before she knocked, which meant he'd been at the window and seen the car, and she didn't remark on this because it was part of the language of him that she had learned. He looked at her. "Good trip," he said. It wasn't a question. "Good trip," she confirmed. He moved back to let her through, and she walked into the penthouse, and it was warm inside, as it always was, and the city was outside the windows going about its spring business, and the fire in the main room was burning. She set her bag down by the door, looked at Seoul through the floor-to-ceiling windows, its neon threads and arterial roads and the Han in the evening light, warm now, silver gold rather than winter silver, the bridges carrying their constant traffic between the city's halves. She thought about a November alley and wet pavement and the quality of his hand against her face, large, warm, the warmth of a person who ran hotter than the world around them, and the specific darkness that had been all she'd known for the subsequent hours and the specific light she'd woken to. She thought about everything between that waking and this standing. Min-jae came to stand beside her at the window, not speaking, just present, in the way he was present, total, unperformed, the quality of attention that had always been the most unsettling thing about him and had become, over months, the thing she returned to. The foundation-level thing, the thing that held weight. "What are you looking at?" he said. "The city," she said. "You're looking at it differently than you used to." She thought about this. "I used to look at it like something I was passing through," she said. "On the way to somewhere else. And now." She turned from the window and looked at him. The scar at his jaw, the tattoos above the collar, the face that showed its fractures now when it decided to, and the controlled surface when it needed to, And both things, honestly, both things as parts of a whole she had spent months learning and was still learning, would be learning, she suspected, for a very long time. Now I look at it like somewhere I live, she said. Outside, Seoul pulsed with neon light and river and the particular indifferent beauty of a city that had never once asked anyone's permission before going about its business. Inside the penthouse, the fire burned, and the storm, the one that had started on a November service road in the rain, the one that had moved through penthouses and stairwells and ballrooms and rooftops and hearing rooms and a kitchen at 11 at night, was over. Not because the world had become clean, but because two people who had looked directly at each other in the dark had decided, with full information and clear eyes, that the light they were building between them was something worth staying in. The city kept moving. They watched it together. That was enough.